We had all the preparations in place, but I still didn't feel ready when the sun got low in the sky. Crows had been stalking Wes all day, trailing him like a hungry, sentient shadow. Their calls were haunting. It sounded like they were mocking us. An hour before sunset, he joined us as we built up the bonfire. In the distance, excited barks could be heard in the woods. The only time Wes reacted to any of the hunt's scouts was to nonchalantly flip off one of the crows that got a little too close. The birds merely cackled. As someone that has seen what hunters can do when they're angry, his brashness made me nervous. I wouldn't have done that, I told him. I figure the more I annoy them, the less likely they are to come after the rest of you. He explained, eyes shining menacingly at the remaining birds. Wes kept watching the sun's progress in the sky, seemingly eager for it to disappear behind the horizon. Meanwhile, Raina and Seri were silent, Raina's eyes shifting towards the crows surrounding us anxiously. Cherry just wordlessly watched as the lamb that had been donated for this Halloween burned. Victor was also watching the sun's descent, but unlike Wes, he seemed tense. The last of our preparations were completed mere hours before the bonfire. One of them came from Wes, who had shown up with a cutlass. That was unexpected. I didn't realize he knew how to use a sword. It's not iron, unfortunately, he informed us, producing a water bottle. So the plan is to coat it in salt water. As long as I can break some skin, it should still mess a few of them up. Not a bad idea at all. The other last-minute thing was that a few hours ago, the boss handed me a gold necklace, saying, "Don't ask how I got this." I stared at him, trying not to smile. Did a cat wander into a jewelry store? I'm sure Yins can guess what face he made. I told you not to ask, and I'll have it back before they ever realize it's gone, so please try not to lose it. I heard Seri mutter under her breath, "Cat burglar." So that was that. Presumably we had all that we needed, just had to survive until sunrise. The very moment that the last rays of the sun died, a chorus of howls arose from the woods, making my heart beat faster. That was our cue to part ways. Before doing so, we wished each other luck. I hoped it wouldn't be for the last time. Once Wes and Victor departed with their escort of crows following them, I pulled my mask over my face, securing it with the same spiked collar that I'd made for the Viscera Eater. My costume was nothing special, just a burlap scarecrow mask and a thick flannel. Admittedly, the mask was somewhat scratchy, but still more tolerable to me than cheap latex. At least I could breathe in it, and it would at least keep my face and hair covered. The next step was to find the Dullahan. Unfortunately, I had no information about where or who it intended to take. However, I did have an educated guess as to where to start. Generally speaking, the neighbors all seem to have a chip on their shoulder when it comes to the burbs, considering that it had been constructed right over where a decent chunk of the forest once stood. There were also more people there for it to hunt than out in farm country. To top it off, far too many of those suburbanites prefer to live in denial about our small-town superstitions, thus making them easier targets. As I drove towards the housing development, I also kept my eye out for any stray crows or dogs. I didn't see any, but with it being dark, spotting those birds would be harder than ever. To say I was becoming increasingly paranoid would be an understatement. What can I say? The mechanic cheerfully telling me that he knew my other fake name had shaken me up, just as he knew it would. I reassured myself that I had my hagstone, I had Ratcatcher, and at the very least, I didn't have to worry about Iolo being the one to seek me out. Just had to pray and hope that the white sun of mist wouldn't decide to wander off after me instead. On that note, I prayed for my co-workers as well, hoping that they'd beat the odds and find some way to escape the wild hunt. And just for good measure, I prayed that Gwyn Nudd wouldn't be the god that answered me. The suburb was lively when I got there. Trick-or-treat was ending, the cul-de-sac bustling with tired kids following equally exhausted parents to get the last of what was in the homeowners' candy bowls. Toilet paper hung from the trees of one house, flowing gently in the wind. Clearly that person didn't get the memo about raisins. I parked on one of the side streets. With how many people were walking around, I determined it would be quicker on foot. After a while, the crowds began to dwindle. Kids cried, some not wanting the night to end, others simply because it was way past their bedtime, and every inconvenience felt like the end of the world to them. Soon, I noticed that only a few others were walking around. Hooves clopped on the pavement. My heart began to beat faster. This was it. A little girl's voice caught my attention. "Wow! Mom, look at that costume!" In response, a booming voice announced, "A costume, you say? 'Tis no disguise, fair maiden." "What?" I whirled around to see exactly what I feared. What appeared to be a large man clad in shining black armor sat astride a massive black horse. This armor was lined with silver, a crest featuring a horse's head emblazoned on his chest. The rider had no head, not where it should have been. Anyway, the Dullahan's head was attached to the saddle by a thick chain, secured right at the bottom of what was left of the Dullahan's neck. To my horror, 4 more heads rested next to it, their eyes wide open in frozen terror, mouths agape. Blood dripped from their necks. The horse pawed at the ground impatiently, snorting and shaking its head as the little girl's excited parent gushed. That looked so realistic. "Man, how did you do that?" "'Pon my word, good fellow," the gargantuan rider replied as he raised the reins to guide the horse forward. "There is no trickery afoot. No fucking way. It's got to be one of the equestrian people around here, right? There's no way this could be the Dullahan, right?" While the rider was distracted, I edged closer with the intent to get a closer look at the head. The skin was loose over its skull, looking as if it was waterlogged. As I got closer, a terrible smell could be detected, like moldy cheese and rotten meat. The Dullahan's dark eyes turned to look at me. When it opened its mouth to speak, I could see that its black gums held sharp brown teeth. As the horse walked past me, the head smiled and politely said, "Good evening, Scarecrow." Am I dreaming? I stammered. "Good evening." The horse began to quicken its pace into a trot. "Wait!" I shouted before the Dullahan could disappear, then quickly added, "Please." The horse stopped, its rider guiding it to turn so that the side that the head was secured on was facing me. Yes, I'd anticipated for this meeting to go completely differently. I'd thought that I'd be running for my life at this point. I had no idea how to proceed at all. Despite his knightly mannerisms, there wasn't a doubt in my mind that the Dullahan was dangerous. Those poor souls it had taken could attest to that. The Dullahan waited patiently. Eventually I asked, "May I accompany you? This is wild hunt territory after all. I feel rather unsafe walking alone." "I could think of no greater dishonor than to leave a frightened thing such as yourself to your fate. Come along, time is short." "What the fuck am I doing?" I toddled along beside him and his horse, trying my best not to stare directly at the Dullahan's head. I was only a few feet away now. Strange, neither the horse nor its headless rider were reacting to my hagstone. That wasn't promising. The sour smell of its head made me gag, though I tried to conceal it. Maggots squirmed around his wide eyes. He didn't seem to mind, only occasionally blinking when they got too obnoxious. They had appeared to have eaten away at his lips and cheeks as well, making his smile look much wider than it should have been. My eyes trailed up, noticing that at the rider's hip was a grotesque weapon, a whip appearing to be made out of someone's spine. I didn't want to imagine how it would feel to be flogged by that thing. Of course, I would know all too well soon enough. Naturally, I was shaking. My throat was tight, partially from fear, partially from trying to suppress nausea. What the fuck was I doing? "Madam Scarecrow." I don't think I've mentioned yet that he practically shouted every word he spoke in his thick Irish accent. I flinched when he addressed me again. "What brings you out at such an hour, and flying solo, no less?" I got off of work late. The Dullahan then began to ramble about the dangers of traveling alone for a lady such as myself, warning me about the desires of men and the even crueler desires of huntsmen. Meanwhile, I was trying to figure out how to proceed. I had the necklace Vic gave me in my pocket. The head was within reach. So did I just take it, just like that? It couldn't be that easy. There was no way. It is said that if someone hears a Dullahan speak their name, they are doomed to be taken by the headless horseman into the underworld. Whatever I had to do, I had to figure it out soon, before he called his next victim's name. "Ah, there we are," the Dullahan crowed, halting his horse in front of a house. "Shit!" Before he could utter another syllable, I fished the gold chain out of my pocket. The great horse shrieked, rearing up on its hind legs. The Dullahan held on, his collection of heads swinging around violently on the chain like a tetherball hit by some aggressive fourth graders. In the resources that I'd read about gold being a repellent for the Dullahan, they all made it sound like presenting the headless horseman with the precious metal would simply make him go poof. But of course, nothing can ever be that easy. His mount continued to rage as his head glared, shouting, "What is the meaning of this?" I drew Ratcatcher, bringing the blade down on the bit of neck left attached to the Dullahan's head. The head complained as it rolled onto the pavement. With only the necklace to separate me from the furious horse and its master, I snatched the Dullahan's head, grimacing as I felt the skin sliding against my fingers. It didn't just have the smell of moldy cheese. The texture of its skin was comparable to it as well, loose, squishy, lumpy. A maggot fell onto my finger and began to wriggle. I yelped and reflexively shook the creepy crawly off. Somehow, I managed to keep a hold of the head, though he definitely did not appreciate it. "Unhand me this instant," he cried. The now headless Dullahan reached down for the spinal whip, cracking it towards me not even a moment after he had the macabre weapon drawn. I flinched away just in time, even as the sound that weapon made me tremble. If I had moved a millisecond slower, he would have blinded me. Even now, the thunderous snap of that whip is still ringing in my ears. With the head secured in my arms, I began to run, making a beeline towards where my jeep was parked. Hooves beat on the ground behind me. While he had his steed and I was on foot, there was no way I could outrun him. I was going to have to try to get there first, preferably without joining the ones on his chain. Another harsh crack ripped through the air, and I lost my breath as the Dullahan's whip struck me across the back. Tears came to my eyes instantly. Blinking them back, I turned, sword raised just in time to block the whip as it came around again. I could feel blood running down my spine. Thanks to the adrenaline, the pain was dulled to a moderate sting. Only a 6-10, it feels way worse now that it's all over. With how much of a fight the rider was putting up, it was simply too difficult to try to defend myself and escape at the same time. Because of that, I ended up dropping the head, standing over it to keep the Dullahan from retrieving it. I ducked under the whip as it whizzed past me again. The bestial horse was just as involved as its rider, trying to kick or bite me when it could. It nearly got me a few times. Was there some way I could get him off of his mount? Or would the horse just pursue me on its own? It definitely seemed like it would, but it was something to consider. I held up the necklace to the Dullahan again. He and the horse shrank away from it. The head let out a tortured groan, apparently able to feel everything that affected the rest of his body. Okay. It backed off for a second. Okay. Just had to think. The gold worked, but not nearly as effectively as I was hoping. It was like using a squirt gun to put out a dumpster fire. Good Lord, what the fuck was I supposed to do with this thing? The whip lashed through the air again. I wasn't quick enough and felt it snap against my shoulder. Better than my chest. The impact made my arm go numb. I'm way out of my league. No, I couldn't think that way. I had to take care of this. I thrust the chain at the rider and horse again, but more aggressively than last time, the necklace swaying just as violently as the Dullahan's whip. The steed, ears back, teeth bared in a snarl, began to take its rider in a circle around me. The Dullahan gathered the length of the whip beneath his arm. I kept the necklace between us, taking care not to stray too far from the head. I wouldn't get another chance to grab it. He couldn't get his head back under any circumstances. Slowly, I backed up, crouching to bring the necklace closer to the Dullahan's skull. The rider shuddered, the metal of his armor grinding together as he gripped his reins tighter with one hand. "If you come any closer, I'll put the chain in your mouth," I warned, dangling the necklace above the Dullahan's wide, maggot-filled eyes. Wordlessly, the Dullahan tugged on the reins. His horse snorted, still showing its teeth to me as if it wanted to drive them into my throat. But thankfully it obeyed its master's command, stopping, its tail lashing angrily. Cautiously, I picked up the head, the Dullahan hissing as the gold drew near to his disgustingly soft skin. I began to wish I'd brought gloves. The urge to wash my hands under scalding water came up quite a few times. As I did so, the Dullahan dismounted, the armor of his boots clanging loudly enough to make me jump. Now that he was off of his steed, I could see just how huge this neighbor was. He towered over me, the armor across his broad shoulders reflecting the streetlights around us. The whip was still under his arm, ready for use. The head spoke to me, its voice still outraged as if our fight was just a mere annoyance to it. "There are souls that require harvesting, Madam Scarecrow, and the night will end soon enough. I haven't the time for this." For some reason, my customer service voice slipped out. "Sir, I cannot allow you to take anyone else in my operating area." I started backing up through the now deserted street, seeing curtains move out of the corner of my eye as people peeked out at us. Every once in a while, I'd hear either an excited or a confused voice from within. I wonder if they thought this was all some impromptu Halloween act. "It is peculiar," the Dullahan mused, his body and vicious steed following me, keeping pace with me perfectly. "I'd recognize the make of that blade anywhere. Yet you have neither the speed nor the strength befitting a rider of the wild hunt. One of their puppets, perhaps. Tell me, Madam Scarecrow, is whatever they've promised you worth the price you will pay?" "This is my price," I told him. "What I get in return is my life." "Ah, I see." The Dullahan's voice had lightened somewhat. "I sympathize with your plight. Truly I do. However, there are many that I seek on this night, and once again, time is short." Instinct told me to duck. I had no warning before the whip soared through the air, aiming for my chest. Quickly, I shoved the necklace into the Dullahan's mouth, hearing him begin to gag. His body doubled over, grasping at his chest. The horse rushed to him, kneeling low to allow him to pull himself into the saddle. I sprinted for the jeep, not removing the necklace until I got the ignition started. It fell out of the Dullahan's mouth as I peeled out, the head sighing with relief as the golden gag was removed. Okay, I was moving and I had the head. All of that was well and good. But now what the hell do I do with it? Wait, the bonfire. Would the flames destroy it? Only one way to find out. That damn horse was fast. Its massive hooves were audible even over the roar of the jeep's engine. As bizarre as it may sound, when I glanced at the beast in the rearview mirror, small flames had appeared in its flared nostrils. Each time its hooves landed, sparks appeared. Good Lord. How did Iolo expect me to fight this thing? Either he overestimated me, or he wanted the Dullahan to kill me, or he's just an asshole. Yeah, that's probably it. Not wanting my co-workers to have a terrifying surprise, I called Rayna. "Hey, I got the Dullahan's head and I'm heading your way now." "You're coming here?" She balked. "Is it that bad?" The horse and rider were not far behind me, the animal not seeming to tire out despite its death gallop. By that point, I was beginning to feel the damage that the Dullahan's whip had done to my back and shoulder. It made moving my left arm hard. Thankfully, he hadn't gone for my dominant one. To top it off, I hadn't seen anything in our records to indicate that the Dullahan was vulnerable to fire, so this was just a shot in the dark that I hoped would work out in our favor. In summary, yeah, it was bad. I told Rayna. Not as terrible as it could be. I could be dead by now. And I did manage to stop him from taking someone else, so that's good. But also I think it's going to kick my ass. The head simply watched me as I spoke, maggots squirming down its cheeks like living tears. How could it be so calm about that? I shuddered. "If I may, Madam Scarecrow," the Dullahan began, his well-mannered way of speaking not lessening the chill of his words. "Wherever you intend to take me, I will follow. My steed is unrelenting and unfailing, much like myself. I do not say this as a boast, Scarecrow, but as a matter of fact. There is nowhere you may go that I cannot pursue you. Upon my word, if you simply allow me to rejoin my body now, I will give you a much kinder passing than the huntsman will." While the Dullahan was frightening, he also seemed to be noble, the key word being seemed, a relic of the days of knights errant, doomed to ride the night in search of human souls. Upon reflection, that must have been why the mechanic wanted him gone so badly. The Dullahan was competition. Even if it was just for one night, Iolo wouldn't tolerate any other beings hunting in his territory. However, at the same time, Orion couldn't turn a blind eye to the Dullahan's business without at least trying to intervene in some regard. No matter what, we would have had to face the Headless Horseman. It's funny. Months ago, taking on a Dullahan would have been far outside of our scope, and to be clear, it still was a monumental task, one that we weren't really suited for. If it weren't for that necklace, I'm fairly confident that I wouldn't be here right now. But only a few short months ago, we wouldn't have been able to do anything more than just try to keep our heads down, stay out of the powerful neighbor's way, then do our best to pick up the pieces afterwards. Yet there I was, using essentially the same tactics on the Dullahan as I do a transformed housekeeper. Maybe that's the secret, right there. Start small, work your way up. After some time and consideration, I replied, "As much as I appreciate your offer, I can't sit idly by as you hurt the people here." The Dullahan sighed before saying, "That is a pity." I didn't like the way he said that. Growing anxious, I glanced back at the rearview mirror. The horse and rider had closed the distance somewhat. Crap. I needed to get at least a few miles on the Dullahan so that my co-workers and I could figure out how to proceed. Feeling the urgency tightening my chest, I put the pedal to the metal. In turn, I saw the horse begin to pick up its pace again, the sparks beneath its hooves growing into flames. That gave me a sinking feeling. Would the bonfire do anything to it? Or was I just leading the Dullahan to 2 more souls it could take? Vaguely, I heard Rayna ask what was going on. In my nervousness, I'd forgotten that I'd called her. "Maybe it's not a good idea to take him there after all," I said apprehensively. "So, what are you going to do then?" Wait, was the Dullahan even closer now? No matter what course of action we chose to take, there was one thing that was certain. I had to slow the horse down. Bracing myself, I told Rayner to hold on a minute, then stomped on my brakes. Tires screeched. The Dullahan's head flew off of the passenger's seat, a deafening crunch as the horse and rider slammed into the back of my vehicle. The horse's face collided with my back window, showering the back seat with broken glass. The rider was launched from his mount, tumbling over the top of my Jeep, bouncing off of the hood and onto the road in front of me. The impact jolted me forward, causing the seatbelt to leave an instant bruise across my collarbone. I hit the gas again, swerving around the Dullahan's body as he began to stand up. In the mirror, I could see that the horse was having trouble getting off of the ground. It was hard to tell with only my brake lights illuminating the darkness, but one of its front legs looked crooked. The wind howled through my broken window. If that wouldn't slow it down, I didn't know what would. I could hear Rayner shouted from the other end of the phone, "What happened? Are you okay? Please say something." "Yeah, I'm fine," I said numbly. "Jeep's another story, though." The Dullahan grumbled from the floor. "Interesting choice, Madam Scarecrow. An interesting choice indeed." Meanwhile, Rayner was convincing me to come to the bonfire. She pointed out that with the sacrifice we'd provided, it wasn't an ordinary fire. It could be capable of destroying the head. Besides, my idea of it not being vulnerable to incineration was just a hunch. I didn't have anything concrete to go off of. There was no sign of that terrible horse or its rider yet. The Jeep's sacrifice had bought us some time. It couldn't hurt to at least give it a try. When I got to the bonfire, I didn't waste any time. I marched over and tossed the Dullahan's head in like a basketball, wiping my hands on my jeans afterwards. I truly can't stress enough how awful that thing felt to the touch. Ugh. The flames merely surrounded him as if they were just as reluctant to touch his repugnant flesh as I was. The head didn't even blink, merely looking inconvenienced. No matter how long the Dullahan's head sat in the coals, it refused to burn. Seri, wide-eyed, brows furrowed, whispered, "That's not good." "No," I agreed as the lump in my throat grew. "No, it is not." "Okay, so," Rayner stammered, now what?" Jerry suggested uneasily. "Do we just kind of play keep away with it until sunrise?" I glanced at my poor Jeep. The thing was battered to hell and back. It was still drivable for the moment, but I wasn't sure for how long. Something had begun to leak from it. There was always the company truck, since the dead duo had opted to walk in case Seri or Rayner needed to make a quick getaway. Howls rose from the forest, followed by excited yipping. The tune Ann sounded triumphant. My blood ran cold. "That's the second time we've heard that," Rayner informed me, eyes lowered in worry. "It might not be them," I tried to reassure her, but I was equally as rattled. "Did the mechanic say how many others they were going after, besides Wes?" Seri asked. I shook my head. Before I spoke again, I took a deep breath, keeping my voice even for their sake. "We have to focus on the Dullahan. The dead duo can handle themselves. I'll take the truck and the head and just, I don't know, drive around town until sunrise and hope he doesn't catch up to me." When the Dullahan suddenly spoke, his voice was low and foreboding. "I'm afraid it's far too late for that, Madam Scarecrow." Metal clanking together, Rayner screamed. Miraculously, I managed to get between her and the Dullahan's bone whip in time, blocking it with Ratcatcher's blade. I told them to take the head and start driving while I held off the Dullahan's body. Cherry seemed to be just as disgusted by the texture of the head as I had been. Lips curled in revulsion as she carried it to the truck after fishing it out of the fire. Even with the bonfire's light, it was hard to tell if that monstrous horse was nearby. I hadn't heard hooves. Rayner told Seri to go, insisting that she wanted to stay behind in case I needed help. She had the squelcher with her as well as a crowbar that she retrieved from the truck. I was about to protest, but had to dive away from the Dullahan's whip again, then roll as he brought it back the other way. Even without his mount, he had a lot of reach with that weapon, far more than I had with Ratcatcher. The truck rumbled to life, then peeled out. I'd expected the Dullahan to react to losing his head once again, but he was entirely focused on trying to flog me to death. At first, Rayner and I remained on opposite sides of the horseman, just trying to stay out of reach of that brutal whip. He swung in wide circles as he slowly navigated around the bonfire, trying to locate us without either his horse or his eyes to guide him. Rayner let out a squeak as the whip lashed dangerously close to her, her eyes wide as she shakily held the crowbar in front of her. I got low, darting for the Dullahan's back. With a grunt, I drove the sword down into his stump of a neck, hoping it would do something. Spoiler alert, it didn't. The Dullahan turned and clocked me right in the temple with an armored fist. The world spun. My ears were ringing. Great, more head trauma. Hands under my arms. Rayner was dragging me away, screaming as the whip missed us by only inches. Ratcatcher's hilt stuck out from the stump of the Dullahan's neck like a bizarrely small, narrow head. I clumsily got to my feet, clutching Rayner's shoulder for balance as we avoided that damned whip once again. I'm not sure how long this dance lasted with the headless neighbor. It felt like forever. At one point, Rayner choked out, "The sky." I risked a glance towards the horizon. The sky was getting brighter, a green halo appearing in the east to announce the sun's impending arrival. We didn't have to kill the Dullahan. Hell, I don't think anyone at Orion was even capable of such a feat. We just had to survive until sunrise. This wasn't his world anymore. Once the sun came up, he'd have to return to the Mounds. I asked Rayner to hand me the crowbar. She obliged, keeping near me as the Dullahan took slow, menacing steps towards where he'd last approximated our location to be. One thing for sure was that I needed to get Ratcatcher back. For one, it's my sword. For another, I'm pretty sure Iolo would rip me in two if anything ever happened to it. Unexpectedly, the Dullahan dropped into a kneel, rolling his whip up and placing it onto the loop in his belt, resting his metal-clad hands on his knee courteously. Rayner and I both froze. What the hell was happening? Hold on, was that Scar music? I raised an eyebrow at Rayner. "Oh, that's my phone," she said with a nervous chuckle, flushing with embarrassment as she then quietly added, "I forgot that I made that my ringtone." "Bleh." The Dullahan didn't move, remaining on his knee. Rayner backed away as she answered it, announcing that it was our co-worker, not wanting to say Sherry's name in case something was listening. She put it on loudspeaker. Sherry said from the other line, "Hey, the Dullahan wants to talk to you." "What?" There was some rustling as she presumably set the phone next to his head. His booming voice was way too loud over the phone. Sherry, thankfully, must have moved it further away from him since the volume gradually became more tolerable. "I must admit that I underestimated you, Madam Scarecrow. You and your accomplices have put me through great pains on this night, but alas, the sun is nigh. I ask that you return my head so that I may make my journey homeward." Rayner and I glanced at each other. The Dullahan was surrendering. That seemed off. "Skeptical," I replied. "We will return your head on the condition that you do not harvest any more souls on your way back, including ours." The Dullahan sighed, then begrudgingly agreed. "Very well. The ones I've taken already will suffice for now." As much as I didn't like the idea of turning him loose to wreak havoc somewhere else, I hadn't a clue what else to do with him. The necklace clearly bothered him, but it wasn't capable of stopping him completely. Would keeping the head and body separated kill him like it did the viscera sucker? As I deliberated, the Dullahan interrupted my internal battle. "I fear that I know what you may be considering. Do not be foolish enough to believe that you would be the first to attempt it. If you allow the sun to rise, I will not perish. Merely, my steed and I will disappear, yet my head will remain. It shall be your responsibility until I come to collect it next Hallows Eve. Is that what you want?" My mind conjured up images of that head sitting in the Orion office like a macabre paperweight, eternally shedding its maggot tears. No, that is not what I wanted at all. That is not what anyone wants. That being said, I still don't know if I made the right choice. God, I hope I did. Hesitantly, I answered, "Okay, my colleague will bring you." After taking the phone back, Seri informed us that the horse had been chasing her most of the night, but thankfully, it had stopped trying to destroy the truck. It was just following her. That was a good sign. She told us that she was going to turn around and head back our way, then hung up. Carefully, I approached the Dullahan's kneeling form, crowbar in hand in case he tried anything. He let me get close, not moving a muscle. I reluctantly reached out to grasp Ratcatcher's hilt. The Dullahan didn't even flinch. I tried to be gentle as I pulled, but the blade didn't budge. Shit! I tried again. The sword still didn't move. When the Dullahan's arm rose, I danced away, ready to defend myself, but he simply reached up and pulled the sword out of his neck with one effortless tug. He then set it on the ground beside him before resting his hands upon his knee once again. Gingerly, I picked Ratcatcher up, then slowly backed away from the headless neighbor, reluctant to take my eyes off of him for even a second, despite his apparent surrender. Rayner and I watched him while we waited for Seri to return. For a long time, neither of us were able to find the words to speak. The Dullahan didn't move an inch the entire time. She eventually broke the silence, commenting, "It's been a while since I heard the hounds. I can't tell if that's a good or a bad thing." She was right. The forest had been quiet for hours. No dogs, no crows, and no word from the dead duo. I think it's a good thing, I eventually told her. Means they haven't been caught. At least I hope that was the case. Hooves. The horse trotted alongside the company truck, the sparks coming from its nostrils shrinking down to mere embers. It nodded at us, ears pricked, as if in greeting. Dreadful animal. The Dullahan rose slowly to his full height the instant I handed him back his head. He showed off his sharp teeth as he grinned, telling me, "A wise choice, Madam Scarecrow." Was he going to retaliate? I clutched the golden necklace tighter, ready to use it against him again if I had to. Instead, the Dullahan ambled past me, cradling his head in both hands. He gently screwed the chain back in to secure the head to his saddle before mounting the horse. He gave us another unnerving smile and a salute before riding off to race the sun. For a moment, the three of us stood in stunned silence. None of us could process what had just occurred. "We actually did it," I whispered in disbelief. "We drove off the Dullahan." My body seemed to realize that it was safe at the same time as my mind did. I collapsed next to the fire, my adrenaline abruptly wearing off. My back and shoulders stung, the pain intensifying in time with my heartbeat. Raina seized the first aid kit from the truck, telling me to stay sitting so that she could check my injuries out. The flogging cuts hurt more when exposed to the open air, making me clench my teeth as Raina examined them. "They're not deep," she assured me, then grimaced as she added, "Oof, they look like they hurt." As she tended to them, taking her time cleaning and dressing the wounds, we waited anxiously for the dead duo, listened for hounds, kept an eye out for crows. The sky is getting lighter. We're still waiting. The dead duo had a far worse time of it than we did. To put it simply, Victor had met us at the bonfire alone. I'll get into what happened to Wes in a minute. Sorry to leave Yins in suspense, but this account of events is all second-hand. To spare us all some confusion, let me start at the beginning of their night. The first time that they'd heard the howls of the Kwyn Anwan, the otherworldly hounds had sounded far off. During their initial trek into the woods, the black birds continued to haunt their steps, chattering to each other as they shadowed the two undead men. However, our co-workers didn't have this unwelcome entourage for long. They didn't see the owl at first. A crow screeched, then its cry was abruptly cut off. The other crows began to chatter in outrage. Victor saw the owl soaring away with one of the hunt's crows trapped firmly in its talons. It was the very same brown screech owl that had been watching us load up the barn with supplies. It had even brought friends, the ranks of which included other birds of prey that dove furiously at the wild hunt's crows, as if they had a vendetta against them. Wes and him exchanged a look. "Friends of yours?" Victor questioned, only half joking. Wes shrugged. "I was going to ask you the same thing." Since the owl and its buddies were keeping the lesser hunters off of their backs, Vic opted just to keep moving without questioning that odd experience further. They could find some way to thank the birds at a later date, preferably when they weren't about to be hunted for sport. The dead duo didn't waste any time once they got to the barn, swiftly pulling out their supplies to start securing the doors. Salt lines were drawn across the thresholds of every entry point, including windows. I guess the boss hurt himself with it, in his haste. Wouldn't be the first time. Occupational hazard for a Draugr. During our initial preparations, one of the 3 extra hagstones had been hung from the rafters. It may sound like a questionable location for a stone, but the hunters can fly after all. Meanwhile, the dead duo kept the remaining 2 stones on them. They were as ready as they could be. At least, that's what Victor had thought at the time. Roughly an hour after they finished setting up, there was a round of hooting and hollering from the hounds. Victor knew in his gut that their chorus meant that the hunters had found one of the appetizers the mechanic had mentioned. After the fact, we found out that both victims were registered sex offenders. Something I'd never thought about until Victor brought it up is that the registry provides full names. The boss explained that it's a useful tool for the hunters, chock full of the exact types of souls they prefer to torture the most. To quote Iolo, "The types no one will miss." Up until that point, the dead duo had been killing time with chit-chat, but after the second appetizer had been caught, all conversation died. Victor was on high alert, listening to every breeze, every creak of the trees, every murmur of the forest. Waiting. Meanwhile, Wes still seemed fairly excited as he kept glancing through the windows to see if anything was coming. Occasionally they'd hear the crows call as they passed the barn by. The owl attack had thrown the lessers off, buying the dead duo a good deal of time before shit hit the fan. Another hour passed. They continued to wait. Wes had begun to pace from pent-up energy. They hadn't heard any hounds or crows for a while. Where were they? There was still time before sunrise. There was a soft scuffing sound outside. Wes's pacing stopped, having heard it too. There it was again, but higher off the ground. The roof. Something was on the roof. Victor didn't hesitate. He took aim and shot at whatever was climbing on top of the barn. They heard laughter outside from multiple sources, followed by Briar's voice from above, mocking. "I've been trying to reach you about your car's extended warranty." Thorns began to slither along the top of the barn, their serpentine movement stopping abruptly as they neared the hagstone on the rafters. Putting it there was a good call. The vines were unable to pass it. Victor fired again into the gathering of thorns, blasting some of them off. They heard the mechanic's voice then, taunting Wes. "You gonna hide in there all night, boy?" To Victor's chagrin, our co-worker didn't hesitate to shout in reply, "Just you." His response was met with more laughter, along with some Gaelic spoken amongst their pursuers. Not surprising that the merry band of jagoffs would take the challenge as a joke. Victor glanced up to see that Briar was standing above the hole in the roof in all of his winged glory, head tilted curiously. The thorns writhed against the ceiling, testing the limits of the hagstone on the rafters. "Don't go out there," Victor warned. Unfortunately, Wes wasn't listening. "If I meet you out there, I'm only dealing with you. Hear me? Dragonfly, no interference from anyone else. One-on-one. Just you." There was a moment of consideration before the mechanic replied casually, "Yeah, I got some time to kill. It'll be a while till the white sun of mist finishes up." That had instantly rang alarm bells in Victor's head. Finishes what? He'd worried that meant that the king of the Wild Hunt had turned his attention to someone else, namely Rayna, Seri, or I. Victor tried to warn his employee again. "Don't." "Oh, be quiet." Briar cut him off dismissively. "He wanted this, didn't he?" Without another word, Wes marched out to face the mechanic, salt-covered cutlass drawn. The boss stepped forward to follow, but stopped once he heard more scuffling from above him. He turned to see that Briar now clung to the barn's ceiling by the hooks in his wings. "You don't mess with the fight, neither will we," the hunter told him lightly. "All's fair, right?" Was it, though? Was it really fair, Briar? It's probably a good thing I wasn't there to piss the hunters off more. "Sure," Victor snapped curtly. "This the thanks we get for helping you with the hag?" Briar scoffed. "Come on, Draugr. I know you don't like us, but you know us better than that. At least you should by now." The hunter had found a spot on the rafters that was just outside of the hagstone's influence to perch on, thorn-covered antlers brushing the ceiling. He continued, "We let you set up this little safe house without making a move to sabotage it. You really think we didn't know what you were up to? Hell, I'm even going the extra mile and taking the liberty to make sure that none of our guests get the idea to weasel their way in here. We're being far kinder to you than we have ever been to any others, and you didn't even notice. Have to say, it's kind of hurtful." Victor stole a line from Rayna. "Cope." When he told me that, I let out the ugliest snort. Clearly the boss was done giving a shit, and he didn't have many of those left to begin with. Briar just shook his head. "You Orion fuckers really have forgotten how to keep your attitudes in check, haven't you?" Victor ignored that comment. "Won't your boss have some choice things to say about you helping me?" Briar chuckled. "Who do you think is the one that okayed this?" "Okay, that's interesting. But one semi-good deed on the mechanic's part isn't much compared to his laundry list of war crimes." Thankfully, none of the other hunters appeared to have any interest in entering the barn now that Wes had come out. He was their primary target. Briar's influence probably didn't hurt either, as begrudging as I am to give him so much credit. To Victor's horror, he then saw that Wes had left his hagstone hanging on a hook by the door. The reason for this was most likely that he wouldn't have been able to get close enough to the mechanic to try to stab him without the stone repelling him. Victor swore to rip him a new one for taking that risk later. Keeping the shotgun trained on the thorned hunter, Victor glanced out the window to see what was going on between his employee and our least favorite psychopomp. According to him, the pair were moving around each other so quickly that it was hard to keep track of them. He'd occasionally catch a glimpse of Iolo's wings or spikes glittering in the darkness, or the reflective Orion Pest Control logo on the back of Wes' jacket. "Your boy is doing better than I thought," Briar commented, swinging one furry leg absent-mindedly. "I should have brought popcorn." "I am very selective about who I hire," the boss informed him. "You think I'd bring on just anyone off the street? You should know me better, Briar." Briar sighed heavily, clearly not happy with Vic sassing him yet again, but conceded with a shrug of his shoulder. "Yeah, you got me there." That's when he heard the mechanic whoop from outside. "Who? Yup, that's Salt." To Victor's disappointment, he sounded more surprised than hurt. The dueling pair had slowed down a bit, circling each other in front of their audience of antlers, growling dogs, and black birds. The mechanic had his banjo strapped to his back, ready to use if he got bored of his wooden sword. As an aside, I wonder if he'd sharpened the blade up before Halloween. That training sword was a bit dull in our sessions. Of course. I could also see Iolo liking the idea of slowly killing Orion's vampire with a dull sword. "You know what you're doing, boy. I'll give you that," the mechanic said, rolling his bad shoulder, a subtle edge to his voice that made Victor think that he wasn't being entirely sincere. Here I was, thinking I'd be humbling some half-cocked little shithead. Gotta say I'm pleasantly surprised. At first, Vic thought that Wes had gotten hit at some point, since his mouth was covered in blood, but then he noticed that Iolo nonchalantly wiped at a gash on his shoulder. Wes had actually managed to take a bite out of Iolo. Along with that, the base of the mechanic's prosthetic wings were bleeding, most likely from forcing the huntsman to push himself before they'd fully healed. He remembered thinking that they might actually be able to pull it off, that they might actually have a chance against the wild hunt. "I'm a bit rusty," Wes told Iolo with a vicious smile. "It's been a while since I've had a real fight." "That why you volunteered?" Iolo asked, as if they were merely making friendly small talk. "Partially." A new voice spoke then. One Victor had never heard before, deep and gravelly. "Are you planning on toying with the poor thing all night?" Every hunter's head turned towards the speaker, including Iolo. The ones watching the fight had bowed deeply, including the Chun Anon, their red ears back against their heads as their backs arched. The white son of mist had arrived. From Victor's description, the king of the wild hunt was equally as magnificent as he was frightening. Great antlers like that of an elk stood from his scalp, adorned with shining crystals that reminded him of icicles. Some of those icy gems were braided into Gwyn's auburn hair, smoky. Ink-black skin surrounded the king's featureless white eyes, and the bridge of his nose like a mask. The ornamentation accented with additional black lines beneath the corners of his mouth. Unlike his followers, the rest of his anatomy was humanoid. No hoofs, fur, or wings. Victor had said he'd expected an ancient god to dress in finery, but instead, the king of the wild hunt was clothed in regular, practical outdoor wear, at odds with his intricate braids and crystal embellishments. The mechanic bowed his head respectfully at the king, replying, "I was waiting on you, sir." The white son of mist grinned coldly, crouching down, resting his elbows on his knees as those white eyes fixed on Wes. "I'm here now." That was when shit got real for the dead duo. The mechanic had gone after Wes with renewed ferocity, the vampire unable to do much more than defend himself against the onslaught. It was hard to see exactly how bad it was between their speed and the darkness. When Victor heard the audience of hunters cheer, his heart sank. He knew that if he tried to get involved, that would only make things worse for our co-worker. That'd give one of the other hunters a pass to intervene as well. Even so, there had to be some way around that. There always was. He just had to find it. He'd slyly glanced at Briar from the corner of his eye. The hunter was watching him intently, chin resting on his fist, daring the boss to make a move. "I've heard many things about you." The voice hadn't spoken aloud. It was a whisper in the back of Victor's consciousness. He tensed up, knowing that he hadn't imagined it. "You and your colleagues don't disappoint. This has been a most special Callan Gaiaf." It was then that Victor had learned the hard way that there was a huge difference between a god that still had his divinity intact and a wild huntsman. When Victor glanced out the window again, he saw that Gwyn's gaze was still firmly fixed on the fight. Unlike his followers, the white son of mist didn't have to look the boss in the eyes to get into his head. And the hagstone had done absolutely nothing to protect him. "Your life was cut short, too short." As Victor recounted this to me, he unconsciously put a hand on his bandana. The god had made him experience the knife cutting into his throat once again, his own hot blood rushing into his airway. Unable to cough enough of it up, he woke up in his murderer's trunk, tasted his killer's flesh. His body was racked with heroin withdrawals, while his father's voice told him he couldn't help him anymore. Then just quickly as it had happened, he was back in the barn again. At some point he'd fallen to his knees, the shotgun on the ground in front of him. "I don't intend to cut it short once again. That would be a waste. Wouldn't you agree?" Victor dared to whisper, "What do you want?" "You've already given it to me." There was another uproarious cry from the audience of jeering hunters. Victor pulled himself back up to the window to see that Iolo had gotten Wes on his back, tearing our co-worker's throat out with those horrible teeth. He paused to spit Wes's own blood back into his face, growling, "See how you like it." There is a selfish part of me that is glad I'd missed that. I've seen Iolo pissed before, but never to the point of going semi-feral. I've decided that it's something I'd never like to bear witness to. In response, Wes dug his fingers into the weak spot at the base of Iolo's prosthetic wings. When he saw that, Victor had rushed for the door, certain that Iolo was going to rip Wes's head off until something huge and furry knocked the furious huntsman off of him. As Wes scrambled to his feet, the boss could see that the mechanic had taken such a big chunk out of our colleague that the ridges of his windpipe were exposed. Wes' savior had been a black bear. It positioned himself between the mechanic and Wes, protectively baring its teeth at the huntsman. In the forest surrounding them, there was commotion from the other hunters as coyotes yipped at the Chunanwun. Trees groaned deeply, as if speaking to one another. From a tall cedar, the brown owl that had protected them from the crow's prying eyes watched intently. Of all things to happen that night, the false tree coming to their rescue was not on any of our bingo cards, especially since the barn wasn't located anywhere near its territory. The last time we'd seen it, it had told us, "The forest will remember your kindness." I guess this is what the false tree had meant. Iolo savagely spat more of Wes's blood onto the ground before calmly telling the snarling animal, "Don't forget, we helped you too." One of the hunters tried to sneak up on the agitated bear. Before he could strike, Iolo seized his arm, digging his claws into the hunter's skin until his subordinate dropped his weapon. He kept squeezing, not stopping until the hunter crumpled to his knees. Using the fallen hunter's bare shoulder to wipe the blood from his fingers, Iolo then turned his head towards the rest of them, announcing coldly, "Don't let me catch any of you trying anything with these here animals. I don't give a flying fuck if they bite you where the sun don't shine. You don't touch 'em, understood?" The army of assholes confirmed that they understood. Once again, the white son of Mist's voice was in the back of Victor's mind, the tone patronizing. "The shepherd of the forest wishes to aid you. The sun is due to rise in an hour. You've gained quite a few luxuries in a short amount of time. Yet, the same question remains. Do you think your friend can make it?" Looking at the state Wes was in, Victor wasn't sure. Our co-worker was putting on a brave face, but the boss could tell that he was hurting, and he was fairly confident that Iolo and Gwyn were just as aware of this as he was. "Only one way to find out," the boss grumbled before marching to the door. That time, Briar made no move to stop him, shaking his head at the mechanic. I told him to take it easy. The bear kept Wes and Iolo separated like a big furry referee. The mechanic circled, angered enough to ignore the blood dripping down his back. I guess his teeth were also stained red. His prosthetic wings drooped. The mechanic had stiffened when Victor came out, his head following the boss like a cat watching an interesting insect. He appeared to be barely holding himself back from going after Orion's manager. Without a word, he removed that damned banjo from his back. Vic had expected him to start playing, but the white son of Mist placed a hand on the mechanic's good shoulder, whispering something that Victor couldn't hear. Whatever it was, it made Iolo visibly relax. However, he still watched every move the Orion employees made. The boss could feel Iolo's gaze crawling along his spine as he guided Wes back into the barn. Briar was still chilling on the rafters when the boss dragged our co-worker inside, though Victor had reluctantly said he couldn't complain about this too much since those thorns were the only things keeping the other hunters from entering the barn from above. That had been Briar's way of repaying his debt to Orion for not letting the hag cook him to death. It's harrowing to think about. If we hadn't had all these favors that we'd collected, the dead duo would have been completely fucked, far more than we'd anticipated. In hindsight, all of our other preparations seem almost silly. How could we have thought that hagstones and salt would be enough to withstand the wrath of a literal god and his legion of sadists? In a worse timeline, Orion Pest Control was violently wiped off the face of the earth on Halloween night. We've heard of it happening to other specialty pest control companies before. It's something we don't speak of often, like just mentioning it has the power to invoke that cruel fate. Wes leaned heavily against the wall, using its leverage to remain standing. His head was tilted to the side, inadvertently showing off what remained of his destroyed throat. The bear curled up next to him, watching the door, ears pricked. When he tried to speak, all that came out was a terrible gurgle. God, poor guy. "Don't talk," the boss told him, clutching the shotgun as he guarded the window. "Just try not to die on me." Wes gave him a thumbs up. There was scraping from above as the thorns began to recede from the hole in the roof. Cautiously, Victor made Wes take his hagstone back. That was when Briar finally spoke again. "I need to go check on my superior, seeing as your boy screwed up his wings again. Oh, and just a heads up, they're about to tear this place down. I suggest you two start running." Victor swore, then rushed over to grab Wes with his free hand, pulling our injured co-worker towards the sliding doors on the other side of the barn. Once he was certain that Wes wasn't going to keel over the instant he let go, he pressed his shoulder against the heavy sliding door to push it open. The bear bounded out ahead of them once the enormous door cracked open enough for it to squeeze through. The animal let out a blood-curdling roar at the hunters waiting outside, its yellow fangs exposed in a clear threat. They gracefully danced out of the way of its claws, making no move to retaliate against it. After the mechanic's harsh warning, they wouldn't dare. Even the Chun Anwen just shoved the foxes and coyotes nipping at their ears and heels away, keeping their own sharp teeth to themselves. They just had to stay near the bear. That seemed to be their best bet. It seemed to know where it was going. They followed their protector. Victor looked over his shoulder, white eyes in the darkness. The white sun of mist was tailing them, hands in pockets. Victor half expected the god to start whistling or humming. That's how casually contented he looked. "Stay near the bear." But would the king honor the mechanic's sentimentality towards the false tree? Victor didn't want to find out the hard way. Slowly, Wes seemed to be recovering from the bite. Very slowly. He was at least to the point where some of his vocal cords were working again. He whispered jokingly to Vic, his voice hoarse. "Can't say I've ever had a giant bug almost bite my head off before. That's a new one." Despite their circumstances, Victor managed to snort. "You're the one that wanted to fight him." "Worth it." "Was it really?" "Absolutely. Sure, I got a little fucked up, but I got to hurt his precious wings. And if you're curious, his blood tastes like cherries." Victor offered him a wry smile. "I wasn't curious, but thanks for telling me anyway." "No problem." There was a terrible crash behind them. The barn. When Victor checked over his shoulder again, he saw that Briar hadn't been exaggerating. There was a flurry of wings and antlers as their only safe spot was reduced to splinters. As that went on, more commotion could be heard from both the wild hunt and the false tree's animals as they brawled. Suffice to say, that false tree is going to get an offering fit for a god as thanks for what it did for Orion that night. However, speaking of gods, there was one thing even the false tree couldn't protect them against. Gwyn ap Nudd, and Victor had lost sight of him. "How are you feeling?" he asked Wes warily, glancing around for any sign of the king. "I'm fantastic, how are you?" Wes rasped. "Don't be a smart-ass. Can you move on your own or not?" "Yeah, sorry." The boss let go of his shoulder, wanting to have both hands available for when the white sun of mist showed himself again. When Victor was telling me this story, he suddenly stopped, closed his eyes and frowned. "I can't remember exactly what happened," he admitted. "The next thing I knew after I let him go, the bear was dragging Wes away by the arm. He wasn't moving. I was in the dirt, covered in claw marks, and the white sun of mist was smiling down at me. While Victor was trying to figure out what the hell had just happened, he heard wings and footsteps from all directions, rushing after their quarry. He couldn't tell friend from foe. They all hurried in the same direction, all except for the king. He stayed where he was, eyes locked on the boss with a tight-lipped grin, daring him to try something. Victor dared. He'd found the shotgun on the ground next to him, snatching it up and opening fire. The god didn't even blink as a hole was blown in his midsection, just kept looking at Vic with that damned smile. This time, when Gwyn spoke, it wasn't in Victor's head. "You've been a real treat for me. I mean that, leader of Orion." He stepped forward. Victor fired again, despite knowing that it wouldn't do any good. It was merely for the principle of it. If the god of the wild hunt was going to torture him or use him to hurt Wes again, he at least wanted to make a stand before he had to endure whatever hell was in store for him. Once again, the white sun of mist didn't appear to notice that he'd been shot. At least Iolo actually had the decency to get hurt whenever I'd blasted him with the salt shells. Victor scrambled to his feet, trying to encourage the god to continue chasing him. If Gwyn was focused on him, that meant that at least Wes would have only the rest of the hunting party to contend with. I say only, as if run-of-the-mill hunters aren't also complete nightmares to deal with, but at least hagstones and salt can repel them. What can you do for a god? "What do you want?" Victor asked again, still backing up as he struggled to reload with shaking hands. Gwyn merely kept approaching, ignoring the animals and hunters rushing around as if it were just him and Victor in the woods that night. What would it take for this to end? Victor questioned. He dropped the salt shell he'd been trying to load in. Fuck! A hand on his throat. The white sun of mist lifted him off the ground as if he weighed nothing. He felt pressure in the middle of his back, then a piercing sensation deep within his chest that made him go limp. Dimly, he glanced down to see the sharp point of a tree limb sticking out of his chest, coated with his blood. His comparison made my teeth clench. I was like a worm on a hook. "Weren't you listening earlier?" The king replied, pulling down Victor's bandana, tracing his slit throat with a light finger. "You've proven to be everything my captain said you'd be. I want for nothing. For..." Without Gwyn supporting his weight anymore, Victor had begun to feel gravity pulling him down. It felt like he was splitting in two. He weakly gripped the branch he was impaled on, trying to pull himself up to alleviate the sensation. By that point, he couldn't. Even with being undead, his strength had been stunted by the shock of it. When he told me that, I instantly started crying. He let me hug him, assuring me that it was his job as Orion's manager to take the brunt of the punishment, whether that was from shitty clients or shitty neighbors. The white sun of mist cast his gaze at the sky. It was turning green. Not quite sunrise yet. On our end, it was roughly the same time that the Dullahan had surrendered to get his head back. He then cupped Victor's cheek, forcing the boss to meet his white eyes as he said, "The next time I see you, I'll be bringing the winter with me. It was a pleasure to finally meet you." He left Victor hanging from the tree. The boss didn't remember what happened after that. He ended up blacking out from the pain. Something hot and wet on his face. He came to on the ground, eyes opening to see a fox's orange snout in his face. It whined, continuing to lick him. He raised a hand, weakly scratching its ears. "Is my friend alive?" he asked it. The sound of something being dragged. The bear was back, gripping a dead deer by the antler with its teeth. Victor reluctantly admitted that his mouth had begun to water. The bear dropped the buck by Victor's side. "The man you protected," Victor tried to ask again. "Where is he?" In response, the bear nudged the deer closer with its snout, snorting. It stared the boss down. It wouldn't lead him to Wes until he ate. Victor obliged it without further argument. "Good news. Wes is alive. Or unalive. You know what I mean. However, he's avoiding Rayna, Seri, and I for our own safety." The bear had fed him similarly to the way that it had Vic, but with how severe his injuries were, an animal sacrifice was just enough to give him the self-control he needed to get home to his emergency blood supply. He'll be taking some time off to recover. I'd say he earned it. Likewise, we're trying to convince the boss to take a vacation. Victor definitely needs one. Samhain definitely could have gone worse for us. Wes, Vic, and I all got maimed a bit, but we survived, in no small part because of the aid from the false tree. If Yins learn anything from what happened to us, let it be this. The forest never forgets. The neighbors never forget. Your kindness will not go unnoticed. I'm sure some of you were hoping for some big, epic battle where we managed to vanquish the beings terrorizing us and live happily ever after. Unfortunately, this is real life, and in this line of work, survival is an epic victory. It's like the boss always says, we're not heroes, we're pest control specialists. When I returned to Deirdre, she threw herself into my arms, having been anxious waiting for me all night. As much as I hated to do it, I'd asked her to stay behind. Not wanting me to have yet another thing to worry about, she'd agreed, albeit reluctantly. Though she promised that if the river gave her any of our shirts, she'd rush over to the bonfire. I fell into a deep sleep in her arms, feeling her soft lips ghosting over my skin, her fingers gently stroking my hair. My dreams were haunted with headless horsemen. My co-workers' skulls were attached to his chain. I woke up crying and unfortunately alone, fingers digging into my pillow. Maybe I should go back to therapy. Hold on, where'd Deirdre go? After that nightmare, I'd instantly panicked, rushing out to look for her, breathing a sigh of relief when I saw that she was just in the kitchen, making tea. I guess she'd been wanting to surprise me with breakfast in bed. Whoops. She did what she did best and calmed me down. The tea helped unclench the fist that was squeezing my heart. Before her, I was never much of a tea drinker, but it's been growing on me. The whole time I could tell that she wanted to tell me something, I could see it in the set of her brow and the tightness of her mouth, the way she anxiously gripped her mug with both hands. When I questioned her on it, she told me that she was waiting until my mental state improved, like the mentally healthy person that I am. I joked that if that were the case, she'd never have a chance to tell me anything. She didn't find it funny. A few weeks back, I saw my own death, Deirdre eventually confessed to me. Naturally, that threw me for a loop. What? Hold on. A few weeks back? And you're just telling me now? She sighed shakily, dropping her mug onto the table so roughly that some of the liquid sloshed out, drenching her hand. She didn't notice. You had enough on your plate, but you're right. I shouldn't have kept it from you, and you need to know that I've put you in a bad position. I didn't mean for it to happen, but it did. Deirdre then told me that she only had one more person left to guide, one more soul to spirit away, then she'll be free from the river. Isn't that good news? I questioned, not bothering to hide my confusion. I was wondering how I was getting away with it, she mused, eyes distant. None of them ever stopped me from keening outside of their jurisdiction. Never. But those damn crows never stopped following me. And when the huntsman retaliated against me, didn't it seem underwhelming to you? No, it looked pretty terrible to me. I disagreed in the kindest tone possible. She had begun to talk rapidly, sounding distracted, barely making sense. If he were to kill me now, as a weeper, he'd be breaking the river's claim on me, a transgression that is punished severely. However, as a human, that'd be a different story. And of course, the huntsman knows it. It took a minute for my tired brain to catch up, but after she'd said that, I saw what she was getting at. Chills erupted over my skin as I voiced the realization out loud. Iolo's waiting for you to turn human. He was the one in my premonition, Deirdre confirmed gravely, eyes fixed on her mug. And I'm sure it won't surprise you to know that he does not intend to be kind about it. Something else. There was something else. Had Iolo not been bullshitting when he'd laid into her a couple weeks back? What had he meant by all of that? I questioned further. Wait, hold on. How does this put me in a bad position? Do you remember the terms of our agreement? She muttered, clenching her fists, near tears. For translating the ledger, you swore to free me from the river. It was my suggestion. In my selfishness, I've doomed you. I've doomed us both. She then added, beginning to cry, I'm no better than them, as much as I try to pretend otherwise. Just as deceptive, just as self-serving. Thanks to my exhaustion, the gravity of her confessions didn't click in my brain immediately. In summary, if I was going to complete my vow to her, I'd have to accomplish one of two impossible tasks. Convince Iolo to not be a violent, jealous bastard for once, or kill him. Judging by the way Gwyn acted around Victor, the king of the wild hunt has a peculiar interest in Orion. Even if I managed to take the mechanic's life, that would introduce a litany of other problems, one of them being retaliation. As much as I love the idea of driving Ratcatcher through his vile heart, the cons outweigh the pros. I put my face in my hands, letting out a tired, muffled, well shit. Admittedly, after dealing with the Dullahan and hearing about the dead duo's trials and tribulations, I didn't have the capacity to be as worried or angry as I ought to have been. She apologetically whispered, delicately touching my uninjured shoulder, Nessa, if I'd known. I don't blame you, I assured her. You risked a lot, so you had to ask for a lot. I'll fix it, she insisted through tears. I'll fix what I've started. You don't need to worry about this. I'll handle the huntsman. I will fix this. Bleh. I came out of hiding to grumble. We'll figure something out, together, but later. What she said next shook me to my core. I think I'll let him do it. That shook me up. What? Each day that I'm like this, I can feel my heart change more and more, she admitted softly. I'm becoming more like them every day. As hateful, as vindictive, as unforgiving. I haven't been human in so long, and each day I forget more and more what being mortal ever felt like. And this world, everything has changed so much. She turned to me, eyes red, shaking as if barely holding back sobs, as she then asked, What place do I have in this world, Nessa? I was so taken aback by all of this that I struggled to find words. Any words. The first thing I thought of to do was pull her close, so that her cheek rested against my chest. For a moment, all I could manage to do was stroke her hair. Of all the things I'd considered when it came to her secrecy, I didn't realize it had been an existential crisis. And yet another bad deal, one that she trapped me into, whether she meant to or not. I'm trying not to be mad at her. I believe her when she says that she didn't mean for it to happen, but it did happen. That's when I just began to talk, letting my heart find the words for me instead of my head. I know it's not exactly the same, but when I was discharged, I felt like everything had gone wrong for a long time. Either I was wrong or the world was wrong. I wasn't sure which. Deirdre kept hiding her face against my sweatshirt. I continued. It took me a lot of therapy and trial and error to figure out where I fit into regular life. Even now, I'm definitely still a bit on the fringe. My world is pretty well consumed with atypical pests and neighbor nonsense, but now, I at least feel like I'm where I need to be. The Weeper raised her head, grey eyes searching mine, face and eyes reddened. You can't find your place in this world if you don't even give yourself a chance, I told her. I'll fix this, she repeated quietly. I'll wait to lead that last one. I'll do anything. I just don't want to be like them. She didn't have to finish her sentence. We don't have to deal with it right this minute, I reminded her. It's been a long couple of weeks. Hell, it's been a long couple of months, but we've weathered the storm. You're the indebtor. As long as you can wait, we can take our time, figure it out rationally rather than having to act fast. Deirdre noticeably cringed when I referred to her as my indebtor, but didn't disagree with me. The guilt on her face was obvious. She nodded with a sniff. That's something for future Nessa and Deirdre to deal with. For now, we've decided that the best thing we can do to try to regain some sanity is to let ourselves soak in the fact that we made it. We actually made it. I'll be taking a bit of a break from posting. For how long, I don't know. But the neighbors will always be angry with us, and people will always be... well, people. So I definitely will have some more stories to tell soon enough. And there are plenty from the past that I just haven't gotten to. Specialty Pest Control definitely has job security, that's for sure. That being said, we all need time to figure out where to go from here. A lot has happened for everyone. There is one bright side to all of this, though. Orion Pest Control has proven that our services can extend beyond some simple infestations. We're still not heroes, but we try our best. For now, I think that's enough. Nessa here. To start, I'll give Yins a brief update on our well-being after Samoin. On my end, I have some more scars to add to my collection, but otherwise, I'm no worse for wear. Though, I do still find myself occasionally having nightmares about beheading. Can only imagine why. The dead duo are back to normal. Wes came back from his recovery with only faint, jagged marks around his throat. So faint that you can only see them if you look in the right lighting. The only sign that he came scarily close to having his head chewed off. In other news, Seri put in her 2 weeks' notice. Can't say I blame her. While she personally walked away from the incident unscathed, she had to witness what happened to the rest of us. She said it made her think long and hard about her future. Ordinarily, leaving isn't really an option for us, unless it's in a coffin. I know that sounds morbid, but that's just how it is. You all have seen how the neighbors are when it comes to vendettas. You'll see even more about that later on in this post, but with how Seri kind of stayed in the background, she may have a chance to get back some semblance of a normal life. I really do wish her luck. After everything, office morale wasn't great for a while. It tends to happen after a rough job like that. It took a few days, but we're all back to joking with one another again. What can I say? We all love being idiots too much to let a little bit of maiming get in the way of that. Exception, Victor is the holder of the only brain cell in Orion. He is more possessive over it than Iolo is over me. So there Yins have it. The world is still turning. The sun is still rising. The rest of this post going forward will be an excerpt from Deirdre, since she already had her thoughts conveniently written out. I figured it would be best to use that to update Yins on her situation, straight from the horse's mouth. With her permission, of course. Her entry is as follows. Writing appears to help Nessa get her thoughts in order, so I'm hoping it'll do the same for me. I suppose it would be best to begin by outlining the turmoil. Perhaps an answer will present itself there, hidden somewhere in the details. I suppose I could start with what I remember, which, admittedly, is not very much. There isn't a hard line in my memories that marks the end of my human life or the beginning of my servitude to the river. Between those 2 points in time, there is only a thick haze that I can't see through, no matter how hard I try. Mortality seems more like a dream, rather than something I'd truly had. At one point, had I ever been married? What about children? Surely, I must have left someone behind. Through my servitude, I have died more times than I can count. While it doesn't happen to me in a literal sense, it is an experience I share with the doomed souls whose shirts I work tirelessly to scrub clean. I feel their last moments as if they were mine. Every suicide, every accident, every anatomical failure. Yet, outside of the river and outside of my premonitions, nothing. Not the wind on my face, the warmth of the sun, or the touch of the woman I'm growing to love. Nothing. As a weeper, I'm secluded on the outside of both worlds, only able to feel human for the brief moment where I live through their final tragedies. There isn't much kinship with the ones from the Mounds either. For the most part, weepers are relegated to the background, rocks on the edge of the road, unable to harness any real power, nothing worth paying any notice to. Though, I would say that their usual apathy is for the better. For the longest time I simply existed, drifting through the decades, grieving, washing, singing, grieving, washing, singing. I didn't feel real anymore. There's a part of me that still doesn't. But then the Lady of Orion told me that she liked my singing. She hadn't looked at me with fear, contempt, or pity, as I'm often accustomed to. She saw me as something else, something more. And those eyes, so dark. Dark enough to lose oneself in, yet so gentle. The kind gaze of someone who truly wants to see the world around her better. I thought of them often, as well as the woman who saw the world through their soulful depths. Our first interaction had been brief, far too brief. When she promised to return, I smiled. When was the last time I'd smiled? I couldn't recall. For just a brief moment, I was real again, and in my selfishness, I couldn't let it go. Let her go. In that regard, I truly am no better than he is, am I? As the days passed before I could see her again, I found myself thinking of her. Who was she? What was she like? Was she truly kind, or had I been imagining all of it, merely forcing my preconceptions onto her? So many questions that needed answers. All I knew was that I looked forward to seeing her again. It's truly a shame that the circumstances of our next meeting had not been better. Her breathing was so labored that I could hear her long before she reached the riverbank. Meanwhile, her pursuer didn't make a sound, following her silently, patiently waiting for his prey to succumb to him. My pulse had raced. I acted, or I tried to. I leapt out onto the riverbank to go to her. Unseen hooks buried themselves into my intestines, pulling, stretching. Tears sprang to my eyes. Unable to breathe, I dragged myself back in. The sensation alleviated, though I still struggled to take in any air after the river's punishment. My chest quaked as my lungs refused me. Unable to leave or make a sound, I listened, helpless to aid the woman I'd been so curious about. Her frantic footsteps drew nearer. She collapsed by the bank, arms trembling. Behind her was a shadow. Before he could reach her, I managed to gather enough breath to yell, "Huntsman, I need her!" The foul shadow passed her, the moonlight illuminating the captain of the wild hunt as he glowered at me. I didn't dare look into his eyes. Regardless, the sharpness of his stare pinned me in place. What cruelty is it that I can't feel her touch? But the huntsman's gaze can penetrate through the numbness of the river. He skinned me with his eyes for daring to stop him from devouring her. The more I argued for her life, the more the huntsman's stare promised. He is far worse than his predecessor. The captain before him had been vile as well, but more content to have their underlings do their work for them. The dragonfly usurped them not too long ago, though I must admit that my perception of time is rather warped. It could have been 3 decades ago or 3 years ago. They've all blurred together. Despite my apprehension, I gathered the courage to fight for her, despite barely knowing anything about the Lady of Orion. The river showed me what the huntsman did to her father. I felt it. My skin peeled off until I was nothing but a miserable husk of screaming nerves. Limbs twisted, then amputated. He'd barely resembled anything more than meat by the time the huntsman had grown bored of mutilating him. While the river never gave me the Lady of Orion's shirt, I didn't doubt for a moment that he had something similar in mind for her if I failed to convince him. After much back and forth while the poor woman clung to consciousness, he'd realized that he couldn't break her vow to me, and eventually acquiesced. I have many regrets, but saving her will never be one of them, nor will be giving her his name. Even if his terrible promises come to fruition, and he destroys me someday, it will have been worth it to know that I'd done what I could for her. What I do regret, however, is trapping her. She'd confessed to me once before that she believed love to be a cage, not unlike the one her mother had fallen into. Even though I hadn't intended it at the time, I'd proven her right by trapping her in this bargain. I became her cage. As such, it is my responsibility to break it. I'd bargained with the huntsman for her life using the rules of our world. Perhaps I can do the same for mine, and by extension, hers. At this point, we are tied together. I waited until she went to work. She told me that she wanted to work to resolve our situation together, and ordinarily I would oblige that. However, she just survived a battle with the Dullahan. She's having to accept that the huntsman will be her curse until the day either one of them gives in or perishes. Unfortunately, this huntsman is terribly patient when it comes to matters like this. Old things like him know how to wait. He will eventually find some other way to try to enthrall her. Nobody deserves this curse, Nessa least of all. Against my better judgment, I sought him out in the hopes of reasoning with him. Reasoning with a lunatic. What was I thinking? Perhaps I'm the real lunatic. However, I had bargained with him as well as those under his command successfully in the past. Mound folk are covetous by nature, always seeking something. I am rude to admit that I am no exception to this. The huntsman can't touch me with the hagstone. The river still has one thread left, tethering me to it. As long as that frail strand isn't severed, at the very least he cannot take my life. When I arrived at his shop, he was busy with a customer. Keeping up appearances, the huntsman gave me a brief, polite wave and smile in greeting. The customer glanced at me in reflex as the door shut behind me, raising his grey eyebrows before turning his attention back to the huntsman. It was surprising to see that the banjo bastard, as Nessa eloquently likes to refer to him, looked rather sickly. He was paler than usual, his lower eyelids accentuated with dark shadows. The seeds must have been taking their toll on him, his penance for pushing himself as he did on Samoin. Orion's vampire had served his purpose well. Regardless of his apparent illness, he still carried himself with the easy confidence of a conqueror. Those hazel eyes were keen as they occasionally flickered towards me, while the old man told him about his grandson's apparent attitude problem. The huntsman was an excellent actor, effortlessly convincing his customer that he cared to hear any of it. Anyone that didn't know the hunter's true nature would believe him. When the old man left him and me alone together, I became acutely aware of those eyes once again, glaring at me as if he sought to pry me open with one of his many tools strewn about. But despite the violence of his stare, he put on a guise of friendliness. "What brings you here?" I reminded myself of what Nessa had said. "Give yourself a chance." Daring to hold the huntsman's gaze, acutely aware that the only thing protecting me from his will was a pebble with a hole in it, I inquired, "What would it take to convince you to spare my life?" He raised his eyebrows with a small laugh. "Oh, you ain't wasting any time. Right out with it." "Please answer the question, huntsman," I urged impatiently. All traces of humor disappeared from his expression as he coolly replied, "Nothing." Truthfully, I'd expected as much, but I thought at the very least I could get him to entertain the idea before immediately refusing it. However, I wouldn't let him reduce me to pleading for my life. I was already in a rather undignified position to begin with. I did not need to go lower. Funnily enough, I continued to attempt to reason with the unreasonable. "If you kill me, she won't forgive you, and she'll never love you." My heart sank when he began to laugh again. "You think that's what this is about? Conad, jealousy, Christ. I'm petty, but not that fucking petty." "So what then?" "Now I know you ain't this stupid," he said, leaning onto the counter. This was a wound that had been festering for some time, one that I'd caused him. I spoke the cause of the gangrenous injury's name aloud. "The ledger." "Eh." The huntsman clicked his tongue and winked in confirmation. Despite knowing it wouldn't do any good, I felt the need to defend my actions. "The game you were playing with the Lady of Orion wasn't a fair one. If I hadn't stepped in, you would have killed her, and I couldn't allow that." His voice became colder than the river's depths in the dead of winter. "Wasn't meant to be fair. And wasn't that just so noble of you? Selflessly sticking your neck out for her?" He'd found this particular weakness back in the corn maze, and was not shy about exploiting it. "I hate it. I hate that I did it. I hate that I allowed myself to become one of them, just as opportunistic. I just wanted to be free." The huntsman's chuckle gave me the terrible urge to clench my hands into fists. "Oh, don't get all mopey. I ain't one to judge. It's exactly what I would have done after all." He was distracting me with his barbs, getting into my head. It took a moment for me to regain my composure, taking in a deep breath before I tried again. "I don't wish to argue with you, huntsman. I came here to discuss things with civility." He snorted. "Did you now?" "I did," I replied evenly. "Is that something you are capable of?" "Probably not, but my afternoon is pretty well wide open, so why don't you go on ahead and try anyway?" That made me frown. "You might consider a hobby sometime." Unfortunately, my retort didn't have the effect I'd wanted. The intent had been to get under his skin as he does mine. Instead, he found it humorous. "Woo! Fiona seems to be rubbing off on you. Gotta say, it does make you more interesting." I sighed, feeling far too much like a scholar dealing with a difficult heckling student. "Will you please take this seriously?" He raised a hand, still smiling. All right, I'll stop being a dick for a minute." The huntsman took a deep breath, sobering somewhat. "Come to think of it, there's one thing you could do to put all of this behind you. You get to be a human again, free to grow old, pay taxes, do whatever the hell you want without me tearing your soul apart. But you really ain't gonna like it." That wasn't surprising. In his mind, I'd done something egregious. As such, that gave him the leverage to ask for something equally as diabolical in return. I told him to name his price. He was all too eager to do so. Fiona's name, the real one this time. My eyes widened. Instantly I protested, "Absolutely not." The fiend shrugged, smirking insufferably. "Told you wouldn't like it." I wanted to argue that there must be something else, but I couldn't. His sights had been set on Nessa for a while. As of now, I'm still unsure if his desires are carnal in nature, or if it more strongly matches the desires of a wolf seeking a doe that has successfully evaded it for far too long. Perhaps even some terrible combination of the two. No matter what his intentions towards Nessa are, it was clear that pleading with him to choose another grueling favor would be fruitless. He wanted her. As shaken as I was, I still dared to ask him a question that had been haunting me for some time. "I truly don't understand you. Why can't you simply leave her be?" He ignored me. "You said some shit earlier about fairness. You already gave her my name, so that'd even everything out, Conad." The huntsman had been dominating our conversation thus far. I couldn't let him continue, so I asked again, "Why not just let her go?" He sighed, clearly losing patience. "Believe it or not, I don't want this attraction to Fiona any more than she does. Funny thing is, I didn't have it till she named me. You think that's a coincidence?" That sounded unbelievable to me. He'd appeared to have had a fixation on Nessa before I'd translated the ledger for her, though that seemed more motivated by hunger than by infatuation. However, if he was saying it, at the very least, he believed it to be true to the best of his knowledge. From what I know about how names can be used to control us, it was possible that by using his against him, Nessa had unintentionally bound him to her. The threat of having him permanently tied to me in the way that he is bound to her is why I've refrained from doing the same. Perhaps that was why his affections towards Nessa were still edged with hostility. "What if I helped you get rid of the attraction instead?" I offered. "That's what you truly want, isn't it?" "What do you think I'm—" The huntsman cut himself off, his eyes suddenly narrowing at the door behind me. "Hold that thought." Abruptly, he turned and disappeared into the back of his shop. Before I could question him, I heard a car door slam shut from outside. Another customer? Sadly not. When I peered through the nearest window, I was greeted by the unwelcome sight of another huntsman approaching. This one was unfamiliar to me. With his stature and the stern expression on his face, he reminded me of a bear. I recalled dreading seeing him, dreading the appearance of yet another huntsman to bring grief to an already grief-stricken region. However, the problem ended up taking care of itself, though I suppose it would be more accurate to say that our usual problem took care of it instead. The bear flounced through the door, not paying me even a passing glance. Without looking back at it, he then reached behind him, surreptitiously turning the lock into place. I didn't dare move, staying still to avoid his notice. Not long after, the captain of the Wild Hunt re-emerged from the back room, casually holding a tire iron in a gloved hand, cheerfully greeting the huge hunter. "Howdy!" Equally as amicable, the bear returned it. "Hello." There was the glint of a knife in the bear's hand. The violence between them was so sudden and unexpected that it made me yelp as I backpedaled, momentarily forgetting about the hagstone's protection in my fright. With one massive hand, the bear had shoved the huntsman back into one of the vehicles he'd been working on, the impact creating a dent in its front. The dragonfly moved just as the knife was driven down into the hood, right where his head had been. Afterwards, there was an awful thud as the tire iron left a perfect imprint on the side of the bear's head. Contact with the poisonous metal briefly caused the bear's disguise to falter, revealing an even more imposing horned figure concealed beneath the veil. Not wanting to be around for any more of this brutality, especially because our discussion had been going nowhere, I crept towards the door. The huntsman caught me, shouting as he wrapped his forearm around the bear's throat, pressing down hard enough to make his opponent's face turn purple. "We ain't done here. You stay right where you are." The veins in the bear's face and neck were bulging as his elbow battered the huntsman's ribs. The dragonfly's grip faltered for just long enough for the bear to break free. Their movements became a blur after that. After he'd snapped at me, I was afraid to leave, not just out of concern for my own well-being, but Nessa's. I wouldn't put it past him to transfer any anger I awakened in him onto her, given how volatile he could be. She didn't need that. Unsure of what to do with myself in the meantime, I uncomfortably glanced around, seeking something to read to distract myself from the brawl. Naturally, there was nothing save for some brochures on full synthetic oil. Meanwhile, it sounded like a natural disaster was occurring in that back room, between the metallic clanks of their weapons and the ear-splitting crashes that would reverberate throughout the shop whenever one of them would attempt to overpower the other. Truth be told, such violence makes me sick. One would think that after vicariously experiencing so much of it in my visions, that I would be desensitized to it. That is not the case. If anything, it has only increased my aversion. Eventually, I heard a howl. It didn't come from the dragonfly. There were a series of horrific, muffled thuds after that. The grotesque sound of meat being tenderized, then silence. When the huntsman stalked back out, both he and the tire iron were covered in blood. "I appreciate your patience," he said breathlessly, wrapping the tool in a grease-covered towel that looked as if it could have been yellow at one point. I struggled to find words after the chaos that had just transpired. As he used a roll of paper towels to wipe the blood off of his face and arms, I warily and with some trepidation asked, "What was that about?" "Oh, him. What else would I have been referring to? Yeah, that happens from time to time. I'm guessing he saw the state I was in after Samoin and thought he had a shot at a promotion. They truly are barbaric. There is a guilty part of me that wishes that the bear had won, but alas, the dragonfly retains his position." He tossed the used paper towel towards the refuse bin, frowning when it bounced off the side, the reddened ball rolling a few centimeters along the floor next to it. With a sigh, he picked it up and placed it where it belonged. "Anyways," the huntsman began, leaning with his lower back pressed against the counter, then folding his arms across his chest. "Fiona's real name. I do not know it," I informed him firmly, "and even if I did, I would not share it with anyone else like us, you especially." He chuckled harshly, shaking his head as he tilted his chin up towards the ceiling. "Us? You ain't one of us, Kinnaid. Not really." Before I could say another word, his voice and stare froze me in place as he continued. "You weren't there when they came in droves, as in our forests to forge their iron weapons. You weren't there when they cut our wings off as trophies, or when they strung my brothers' and sisters' bodies up on trees. You weren't there when we lost everything. You ain't one of us." Swallowing, I summoned the audacity to point out, "And now you're attracted to one of them." His laughter was bitter. "Yeah, fucking joke, isn't it?" After gathering some more bravery, I presented him with my earlier offer once again. "If I find some way to help you dispel the attraction, will you allow me to live once the river releases me?" All traces of humor had drained from his demeanor. "I ain't negotiating with you. You want to live so badly? Find me her name. Please be reasonable." "I am being reasonable," he interrupted calmly. "Now, I'll admit that I shouldn't have underestimated her and made that bet in the first place. That's on me. However, if you hadn't translated that ledger, I'd have made a fucking buffet out of her and her colleagues a while ago. Come on, Conad, you had to know this was coming." "I did," I conceded. "From the beginning, I was aware that there would be repercussions to aiding her, but you said yourself that the Lady of Orion is worth the trouble. I'm inclined to agree with you." "Yeah, she is some trouble, ain't she?" Despite professing his resentment about what he believed to be a manufactured attraction towards Nessa, he sounded as if he were fond of her when he said this. At the risk of agitating him again, I gave my honest thoughts in the hope that it could eventually lead to some resolution. "Given what you told me earlier about your history, I can imagine that it's easier to believe that your desires towards Nessa stem solely from having your name taken. However, I can't help but wonder if there's a bit more to it that you haven't acknowledged." His eyes slitted, though his smirk remained as he playfully asked, "You trying to psychoanalyze me, Conad?" "Not at all," I insisted evenly. "I'm merely telling you what I see, and what I see is someone who would rather convince himself that he is being manipulated rather than enamored." He shrugged. "Well, sounds like you best get your eyes checked. Now, are you going to get me that name, or are you going to continue to waste my time? I got a body to dispose of." Maintaining my guise of patience, I took a deep breath, then explained. "The point I'm trying to make is that learning her name won't stop the attraction. Neither will eliminating me. All you'll serve to do by pursuing either option is ensure that your infatuation will remain unrequited. The best thing you can do for yourself and for Nessa is to let her go. Let us go." He pursed his lips in a pantomime of consideration, though I could tell that his mind was already made up. It had been made for a long time, and it wasn't about to change. Eyes on the ground, demeanor light, he questioned, "Can I ask you something, Kernat?" Hesitantly, I told him he could. A naive little part of me wondered if agreeability would encourage him to find some semblance of mercy in his black heart. He snickered as he asked, "Just between you and me, do you actually care about Fiona? Or do you just care about what she can do for you?" Naive indeed. I should have known better. I did know better. The only thing something like him can understand is cruelty. I shook my head in disbelief at what he was accusing me of. "I'm not like you, Huntsman. I don't see people as a means to an end." "That ain't an answer," he taunted. Despite knowing that I didn't have to justify myself to the being that has repeatedly assaulted Nessa in every way that he could, beating her, forcing himself on her, manipulating her, the implication that I was using her as he would made my blood boil. "Not that it matters to you, Huntsman, but I do care. And even if I'm not here to see it, I know that she will be free of you someday. They all will be. You talk about the repercussions of my actions. What about yours? You've been a terror for centuries by your own admission. You and yours are a blight upon this world." "So it's the latter." His response made me reconsider my stance on violence. Trying to defend myself had been a mistake. No matter what I said, he would twist my words to make me out to be as villainous as he is. "Believe what you want, Huntsman," I uttered in resignation. "I'll leave you to tend to your guest." As I departed in what I hoped appeared to be a level-headed manner, he mockingly told me that if I changed my mind on betraying Nessa, I knew where to find him. Going there had been foolish. Clearly, trying to discuss things like civilized people was beyond the Huntsman's capabilities. To be clear, I'd known from the beginning that my involvement in saving Nessa's life wouldn't be without its consequences. However, he had surprised me before by aiding her and her colleagues with the hag. There was a small, stupid part of me that had been hoping he'd surprise me again. There has to be another way. I will neither give up on my life nor my freedom, though I refuse to betray the woman I care about to obtain either one. As I've noted before, I am selfish, and at this moment, my most selfish desire is that she would have let him die. Even after describing my situation and re-examining my abysmal interaction with the Huntsman, I still don't have a perfect solution. I'll outline the possibilities I've already visited so that I don't linger on them any longer. Leaving after severing my tie to the river is not an option. Running from a Huntsman is ill-advised to begin with, but with the grudge he has against me, there isn't a doubt in my mind that he'd hunt me to the ends of the earth. There's the possibility that another hunter could take advantage of his injuries, just as the bear had attempted to. With any luck, one of them will usurp him just as he did the captain that controlled this region before. However, he has proven himself to be formidable, even in weakness. There is also that possibility that his hypothetical replacement could be worse. When Nessa came home from work, she informed me that the employee who uses the false name, Seri, had submitted her 2 weeks' notice. After the events of Samoin, it is completely understandable. The hunters didn't appear to have as much interest in her as the others, so they're praying that she'll be able to make a clean break once her time is up. That gave me an idea. Judging by her reaction, I apparently caught her off guard when I asked, "What were the exact terms you set in your bet with the mechanic about his potential claims on Orion employees?" Her brow furrowed as she tried to recall the exact words that they'd exchanged. If I found his name, he had to relinquish his claim on all employees regardless if they were living, dead, or undead. Why? Does that apply only to those employed during the time of the deal, or does that extend to those brought on afterwards? She frowned. Come to think of it, we didn't specify. In hindsight, we should have. The Huntsman would probably point that out as well. It truly is a shame that one has to be both ruthless and cunning. "Why?" Nessa asked, throwing herself onto the couch next to me. "Are you worried the hunters will look for Seri?" Terribly enough, I had been so focused on my own situation that I hadn't considered the threat to her colleague. But now that she'd mentioned it, I was concerned. "That is a frightening prospect," I said, not wanting to admit my self-absorption. "I also need you to know that I spoke to him today." She gave me an incredulous look. "Wait, you spoke to the mechanic? Willingly?" After I apologized for my secrecy, I relayed the entire experience to her. She wasn't happy that I'd gone without warning her beforehand, which I accepted. I should have told her what my intentions were. As I showed her the recollection above, she snickered when I confessed to telling him to get a hobby, but otherwise her face was grave as she read my account of events, especially when I described the challenge from that other hunter. "But to be clear, you did specify all Orion employees, did you not?" I inquired after she was done. She nodded. Yeah, we did. Then we might be able to argue that all includes current and previous employees. As long as there is an employment history, Cherry should fall under that protection. The same should go for any others that your supervisor recruits afterwards. Her pale eyebrows rose. I think you might be right. Of course, that's only protection from the mechanic, but that's better than nothing, right? I nodded. It is. But in truth, that isn't the sole reason why I brought the subject up. That was when I asked if there was any possibility that her employer would consider hiring me. A glimmer of recognition made her gloriously dark eyes shine like a starlit night. Without another word, she called the leader of Orion. When he answered, it sounded as if he'd just awoken, or that he'd rather be doing anything but speaking to someone else. From what little I know about the Droga, both possibilities were equally viable. Nessa didn't help matters. Her way of beginning this conversation was, "Hey, you want to hire my girlfriend?" I failed to consider that she has made annoying him into an art form. I put my face in my hands to hide from her impish grin, not wanting my laughter to be audible over the phone. There was a loud, heavy sigh from the other end of the line, followed by an exhausted, "What?" "Okay, hear me out," she said. "First of all, she's a genius." Flustered and giggling like an idiot, I whispered, "Will you stop?" Nessa carried on as if I hadn't said anything. "She is a genius that figured out that as long as someone is or was employed at Orion, the mechanic can't eat their souls. Not to mention that she has been extremely valuable to our organization, such as finding all those hagstones for us. Honestly, she should have been on our payroll a long time ago, and you've been benefiting from free labor." "Buster!" Even though I couldn't feel it, I was certain that I had to be blushing. When I glanced in the mirror hanging at the end of the hall, I discovered that I was right. Victor replied, "Splendid, she can take your spot. Even if you fired me, I'd just show up anyway, and with a lawsuit, since you're making us work for free." With another heavy sigh, her supervisor asked, "Can I talk to her instead of you?" Instantly, I became nervous as she readily handed me the phone. With a shaky exhale, I accepted it, taking it off of the loudspeaker option in case the Droga wanted privacy. Since I wasn't as familiar with him as my beloved is, I felt the need to be polite. "Good evening. Sometimes I forget how nice it is to speak to another grown-up." He joked, thankfully sounding less irritated with me than he had with Nessa. After a swallow, I explained to him all of the intricacies of my situation, about the premonition of my own death, leaving out the details of this vision that continued to haunt me. My ribs breaking as the huntsman reached into my chest as he had before, but without the river's numbness to spare me from the pain this time. The firm coil of his hand around my heart, mere seconds before arteries tore, stretching to the point of snapping as he took his time ripping my heart out. Darkness swallowed me even before I felt the tip of his finger burrow into the tear duct of my right eye. I shook off the memory, going on to say, "Because of the verbiage of Nessa's deal with the one you refer to as the mechanic, I have reason to believe that the only way that I can survive after escaping from the river is by using the protection that Orion has been granted by naming him." The owner of Orion sounded somewhat apprehensive. "There are some concerns I have, the first being that the deal was only about employees' souls. He'd still be able to take your life if the opportunity presented itself. Unfortunately, the fucker is smart, so that won't escape his notice. He could also enlist either Briar or the Houndmaster to do the job for him, since the deal only applies to the mechanic." The leader of Orion was right to point all of this out, but even so, it's not complete protection, but it's more than what I have now. "That's true," he agreed. "And you're aware that you'll have to handle iron and salt." "Once I'm human again, neither of those will be an issue," I assured him. He was quiet for a moment as he considered. I held my breath in anticipation. Eventually he said, "Well, I suppose we do owe you for all that you've done for us." Nessa seemed pleased to hear that come Monday. I will be joining the Orion crew. The plan is for me to complete my onboarding before I end my servitude to the river. This way, we can ensure that the huntsman can't reach me before Orion's protection is in effect. She also said that she wants to gauge the huntsman's reaction to the news of my hiring. Her thinking is that a negative response will indicate if we're on the right track or not. As much as it pains me to acknowledge it, she appears to have gotten to know the huntsman fairly well enough to see through him better than she had probably ever wanted to. On another note, Nessa has asked if she can publish my account of events, provided that I'm comfortable with it. Admittedly, I'm nervous to have my private thoughts put before the eyes of strangers, but in the end, it might not be a terrible idea to have a few more sets of eyes to look over our circumstances. It's entirely possible that there is something we are missing that someone else could see. Our first atypical call after Samhain was, regrettably, a human infestation. At the risk of sounding unprofessional, it was a nasty one. Not quite as high up on my personal list of most disgusting cases as the worms or the centipede curse, but it's definitely up there. Before I get into that, though, I want to make it known that there will be discourse of starvation as well as vomiting going forward. This case was not pretty, to put it mildly. I know that those can be difficult topics for some individuals, so I thought it best to give a warning ahead of time. The client called us up after her doctor wasn't able to find anything useful. She'd dropped 20 pounds in 2 weeks, which is definitely cause for alarm. One thing that can cause such symptoms is called hunger grass. It's a patch of grass that becomes cursed for a variety of reasons. Some sources state that the neighbors plant it, hoping an unsuspecting human will wander into it. Others say that it grows over the graves of those who were subjected to improper burials, or in areas afflicted with food shortages. It's because of these last two reasons that hunger grass was said to be rampant during the Irish potato famine. No matter the cause, the end result is the same. Anyone that comes into contact with it is doomed to be afflicted with hunger pains for the rest of their lives. No matter how much the victim eats, there is no known cure. The victims are cursed with eternal starvation until their bodies eventually succumb to atrophy. One of the things that makes it so dangerous is that, to the uninformed, hunger grass looks just like any other thicket. There are no warning signs for it, which makes it far too easy to get the curse by accident. It is said that carrying a bread crust in one's pocket can protect you from the curse's effects, but that doesn't really help much if you don't know that there is hunger grass nearby. "I'm just so hungry," she complained weakly. "No matter how much I eat, it doesn't help." "When did this start?" I asked, already making a plan in the back of my head to question Deirdre on if she knew of any hunger grass in the area. Speaking of, it was her first day. She and Victor had a lot of ground to cover, so if I was correct about the grass, I'd have to wait until they returned. However, the client said something that made me rethink my initial diagnosis. The last time she could remember being well was when she'd been in her rowboat, enjoying a serene day on the water. That prompted me to question, "By chance you didn't happen to fall asleep while on the water, did you?" Yeah, I dozed off for a bit. Why?" "Oh no, not hunger grass after all." I politely requested the client to hold on for a second, then got Rayna's attention. "You ever deal with a joint eater before?" I asked. Her face fell, eyes widening as she silently reached for the phone. That was a yes if I ever saw one. She then told the client, "Ma'am, I'm going to have to ask you to meet us by the river. Are you able to get there on your own, or do you feel too sick?" The client admitted that she was extremely weak, so we offered to pick her up before heading to the river. For one, starvation is no joke, especially if its root cause is parasitism. The last thing we wanted was for our poor client's body to give out. That, and with what Rayna and I had to do to treat the infestation, she was going to need all the strength she could muster. Before collecting the client, we stopped to get some supplies. Joint eaters get their name because of their parasitic nature as larvae. In order to complete their life cycle and reproduce, they require a host. Sometimes it's animals, other times it's humans. They aren't picky. They tend to take the form of newts in order to be small enough to enter a host's mouth. They like to go after those that fall asleep by the fresh water they call home, so our client was, unfortunately, their ideal target. Once they make the host swallow them, they begin to consume every morsel that their host tries to eat, hence why they're called joint eaters. While they're living it up inside the host's GI tract, that's when they'll reach maturity. The longer the joint eater infestation goes on, provided the host survives long enough, the higher the likelihood of it producing young, which also feast off of the poor host in a similar manner. In other words, we had to be quick. If the client was having trouble moving around, that wasn't a good sign. One of the things we had to get was cooked meat, so we settled for one of those unreasonably delicious grocery store rotisserie chickens. The other was a big container of salt. The reason for these two items will become clear in a moment. The next step was to grab the client. The poor woman's cheeks were hollow, her skin sallow and pale. She leaned heavily on me as I half led, half carried her to the company truck. She felt cold, her elbows bony in my hands. The moment the client smelled the chicken, she stared hungrily at it. I felt terrible doing it, but in order for what Rayna was about to try to work, we had to withhold the food from her. "Sorry," I muttered, meaning it and wincing. "It's part of the treatment plan." Our emaciated client just nodded, leaning her head against the window, her eyes quickly fluttering shut. Eventually, wheezy little snores began to escape her lips. Raina, who was the one driving, exchanged a brief glance with me that told me she was feeling just as remorseful as I was. But it had to be this way. Once we got the joint eater out of her, the client could have as many rotisserie chickens as she wanted. The drive to the river seemed to take forever. With how fatigued our client was, she kept dozing off and on into fitful sleep throughout the journey. Once we parked, Raina gently tapped on her to wake her up. The client needed both of us to support her on our way to the riverbank, each of her thin arms around both of our shoulders. She'd said she lost 20 pounds, but with how frail she was, that leads me to believe that she must have been underestimating that number. Raina and I gently guided her to sit on the ground. Once we had her situated, Raina began to delicately explain how we were going to get the joint eater out of her. "We can either make it leave your body willingly, or we'll have to make it too inhospitable for it to survive," she informed the sick woman. "Neither way will be pleasant. We'll try the first thing I mentioned first, since that's the lesser of the two evils." The client let out a shaky breath. "Whatever you have to do, just do it." "I'm going to have to hold you down," I told her gently. "Is that all right?" She nodded, groaning softly as she leaned to lay down on her back in the grass. Trying to be as gentle as possible, I kneeled over her, placing my hands on both of her shoulders. The client's cheeks were wet, lip trembling. "We're going to get this thing out of you," I promised her, trying to comfort her. "You're going to have your life back in a few minutes. We just need you to hang in there, all right?" The client sniffed, nodding again. She took a deep, trembling breath, then whispered, "I'm ready." Raina and I exchanged glances, silently confirming with one another that it was time to get started. I kept the client pinned on the ground, doing my best not to hurt her as Raina removed the chicken from the plastic container that it came in. She held the mouth-watering entree a few feet above the client's head. The client's chapped lips parted, her eyes glued to the meat above her head. I know how cruel this all sounds. Holding food above a starving woman's head, just out of reach. In truth, I felt like the scum of the earth doing it. By the way, Raina's brows were screwed together. Her conscience was screaming at her too. Suddenly, the client's body jerked beneath me. Her eyes went large, her mouth shutting, lips tightening as if she were fighting the urge to vomit. It was working, thank God. The client shuddered, whimpering. I pressed her shoulders into the ground, keeping her still. She began to struggle, trying in vain to knock me off of her, spittle gathering in the corner of her mouth. A lump became visible in her throat, slowly creeping up towards the client's mouth. It took everything I had to keep from gagging at the sight. "Let it out," Raina told her. The client's jaw dropped as if to scream. From behind her tongue, two slimy hands emerged, the dark orange fingers webbed. One of the hands reached out to grasp the client's chin, pulling itself towards the chicken, while the other hand swatted at the meat blindly. Tears began to stream freely from the client's eyes. Raina backed away, keeping the chicken out of the joint eater's reach. It let out a grumble as it continued to pull itself from between the client's jaws. She whimpered again as its beady black eyes became visible next, its wide mouth and flat nose reminding me of a frog. As Raina kept creeping closer to the river, more and more of the joint eater became visible, its slick torso halfway out of the client's gaping mouth, her saliva dripping off of the parasite in thick strings. Eventually, it got impatient and just leapt out of her mouth with a growl, revealing its absurdly long legs, the knees pointing up to the sky like a grasshopper's. Raina quickly scrambled back, hurriedly ripping off one of the chicken's legs and tossing it into the water. The joint eater dove in after it, disappearing beneath the surface with a heavy splash. The client sobbed, "I feel another one! God help me!" We'd been afraid of this. It had birthed more, and from the looks of things, our client couldn't take much more of this. "All right, I need you to open your mouth," Raina told her, picking up the container of salt. "And you need to swallow as much of this as possible. Can you do that?" Crying so hard that she was shaking, the client nodded. She was a trooper. She asked me to help her sit up, taking the container with a trembling hand. The client then proceeded to swallow mouthfuls and mouthfuls of the salt, grimacing as it went down. At one point, she had begun to dry heave, needing to slap her hands over her mouth to keep it down. She trembled violently the entire time. I kept a hand on her back, doing my best to encourage her the entire time. "You're doing great. You're going to be okay. This is going to drive all of them out." After fighting to swallow another dose of salt, she suddenly stiffened, eyes large and wild. She began to crawl towards the river. I stayed by her side, gathering her hair as I heard her gag again, like we were drunk girls in a college bar. When her mouth opened again, there was no slow build-up as the remaining joint-eaters fought to escape her body. These ones, being juveniles, were smaller. They hadn't developed their legs yet, slithering over each other in a steady stream as they hurried towards the water. While the salt makes them leave faster, it's also much more violent. But with how weak and shaken up the client was, quicker, more aggressive treatment seemed necessary. After the last one flew out of her mouth, the client let out an agonized groan. "Is it over?" she whimpered. "Do you feel anything else?" Rayner asked warily. The client shook her head. "That should be all of them then," Rayner assured her with a sigh of relief. "We're going to get you to a hospital," I informed the client as I gingerly picked her up. When we got her there, they took her in quickly. Between the joint eaters' tenancy and the means we'd employed to evict them, she was malnourished and dehydrated. They'd know better than us how to get her back into good health. That was about a few days back. The client reached out to us yesterday. To our collective relief, she let us know that she is doing much better and that she was grateful for everything we did for her. Sometimes this job can be thankless. It was nice to have a client call back and give us such kind words and appreciation for once. It was also a welcome change of pace to have something relatively simple to contend with. No gods, no headless horsemen, no terrible debts. However, when it came to the threat to Deirdre's life, I had begun to overthink, and then I overthought some more until I came to an epiphany. I'm tired, so tired. The mechanic is a truly exhausting nemesis to have. It feels Sisyphean. I pushed the boulder up the hill, stopping him from committing one atrocity, only for it to roll back down again, over and over. For how much longer? Until one of us is dead. Until Orion is wiped off the face of the earth, only for a less competent company to take over. Until we finally kill the mechanic, and he is similarly replaced with another devil. Does it truly have to be this unending cycle? Stopping Deirdre's vision from coming to fruition was obviously a priority, as was ensuring nobody would be following Sherry on her way out the door. But after so much deliberation, it became clear that both situations were part of a much bigger picture. The feud between Orion and the Wild Hunt. We tried fighting, we tried negotiating, neither worked. Maybe it was time for something else. At the risk of sounding like an idealist, maybe compassion would be the key. Unfortunately, I'd need at least one of the hunters to meet me halfway. The exact same neighbors who've held vendettas against not only us, but for humanity as a whole for hundreds of years. If Iolo's rant at Deirdre and Briar's tirade in the church are anything to go off of, I'm not sure about the Houndmaster's stance, but I'm sure it's equally as unfavorable towards us. I thought I should start with the huntsman I have the most contact with, even though he was the one I suspected would be the least cooperative. Beforehand, I decided it would be prudent to discuss my intentions with Victor first. Rayner had abducted Deirdre and Wes to give Seri a proper send-off, as well as for employee bonding purposes. The boss and I would be joining them all afterwards. When I was done explaining all that I'd been deliberating, the boss didn't sugarcoat it. He's never going to go for it. Probably not, I agreed with a sigh, not without some sort of incentive. And how exactly do you plan to convince an ancient psychopath to consider empathy for the first time in his long life? With a snort, I joked, "Well, when you say it that way, my idea sounds ridiculous." "I don't need to remind you that the neighbors don't think the same way that we do," Victor replied softly. "Especially the hunters. From my time with them, I've seen firsthand how that old anger has never gone away. If it hasn't by now, it probably never will." He was most likely right, as usual. The neighbors aren't exactly known for having a high propensity for forgiveness. For the most part, they don't consider lesser beings like humans worthy of such consideration. We're the spider in their house, and they'd rather crush us than carry us outside. But then again, Briar didn't have to pick the Knight of Samoin to repay his debt to Orion. He also didn't have to warn the dead duo about the Wild Hunt's intent to destroy the barn. And Iolo didn't have to permit him to do either of those things. It would have been so easy for either of them to simply let their hunting buddies have their way after the debt was fulfilled. That had to count for something, right? At the risk of sounding naive, maybe it's just because no one's tried it, I told Victor. He was well aware that I was most likely going to try it anyway, so all he did was warn me, "Don't get your hopes up." I assured him I wouldn't, then left for the Skull Trees. Wouldn't want to be late for that. When I arrived, I found the mechanic sitting cross-legged in the grass, a large black cat curled up in his lap. A Maine Coon. The cat had a little patch of white on its chest, making the sizable animal look like it was wearing a fancy suit. He scratched the cat's chin, its purrs audible from across the clearing, eyes closed contentedly. "How's your new employee?" he asked with a smile. Of course he knew already. I furrowed my brow, not trusting how nonchalant he was being about the situation. Deirdre still hadn't cut her ties to the river. We were waiting to see how he responded to this news first. "She's great," I replied cautiously. "I think she'll do really well." The cat in his lap, eyes still shut, rubbed against his hand, indicating that he wasn't allowed to cease petting it for even a moment. The mechanic obliged by moving on to scratch it between the ears. With a light-hearted chuckle, he questioned, "So, what brilliant loophole do y'all think you found with that one? I'm dying to hear it." Once again, it appeared this was just fun for him. That made me wonder if I should even bother trying what I'd been considering. Yes, I had to. While Iolo and I have a lot of bad blood, he's also the hunter I know the most about, and as much as we apparently mutually resent his interest in me, it's definitely there. If you really squint your eyes and tilt your head at an angle, that could be considered a form of rapport, right? I answered his question uneasily. You can't take Orion employees' souls, and I know we specified all employees, regardless of humanity and when they were hired. That's true, he conceded with a smirk, but that's operating on the assumption she'll have one. That caught me off guard. I blinked like an idiot. But she'll be human. Little fun fact for you, Fiona. We don't have souls. When you die, you go somewhere. When we die, we're gone. Nudd's already died once. What makes you so sure she'll have one? Because she had a premonition of you ripping it out, I informed him flatly. Huh. Well, that answers that question, he said with a small laugh that made me reconsider what I'd discussed with Vic prior. The idea of him butchering her like that. I wish I could say I had the energy to be sickened, but for him, that was just par for the course. You cross him or those like him, you suffer, and that was that. Simple, brutal justice by their standards. I sat down in front of him on the ground, not shy about meeting his gaze, as I prepared myself to talk competitively. There's something else you're not considering. The cat gave him the airplane ears when he stopped stroking its head as he leaned forward. And that is? The cat's eyes finally opened. They glowed orange, like a jack-o'-lantern's. Not a cat, after all. The not-cat turned its head and mewed at Iolo, clearly unhappy with the lack of attention. Without taking his eyes off of me, he went back to stroking its chin. My polite argument was, by helping us, she helped you. She gave us hagstones to wield against the cookie hag. You know as well as I do that without them, we would have been screwed. His eyebrows rose. Do we also owe Remington for making that shotgun y'all brought? Or Morton for making the salt you used? Hell, maybe we even owe the river she got the stones from. Getting a bit too indirect there, Fiona. Unfortunately, he had a point. Even so, I had more to say. If you would have taken my soul like you wanted to, you would have had to deal with the hag alone, and you might have lost far more than just your wings. With one hand still on the knot-cat, he used the other to prop his chin up, elbow resting on his knee as he gave me a withering glare that rivaled Victor's. You're really reaching with these. Yet you can't tell me I'm wrong, I argued, still keeping my voice even. So instead of going back and forth like this all night, trying to outthink each other, only to end up resenting each other even more than we already do, why don't we discuss something more productive? And that is, we can break this cycle we're all stuck in, or at the very least start the process. He laughed humorlessly, that annoyed expression deepening. What bullshit are you trying to pull now, Fiona? Even the not-cat seemed curious to hear what I was about to say, its orange eyes bright in the darkening forest. We all keep going back and forth, I explained, not letting the derision in his tone or the not-cat's judgmental look deter me. One side does something, the other retaliates, and so on. It never ends. Oh, here we go, he said with a sigh. Forcing myself to keep my cool as best as I could, I urged him, please let me finish. I already know what you're getting at. He sounded tired. Let bygones be bygones. Turn the other cheek. Forgive and forget. Heard the exact same spiel when we were forced under the Mounds. There it was, that bitterness. Think about it, mechanic. I tried, using my difficult customer voice on him. Why did you join the Wild Hunt? I know you weren't born into it like how Briar and the Houndmaster were. You used to be a guard for Kaya Sidi, right? He continued to stare daggers at me. Why else? Hunt's the only organization that ain't cowering in the Mounds and licking the boots pressing into their necks. This was clearly a sensitive topic. I had to be careful. It shouldn't have happened. The way the neighbors were treated was horrible. I lamented, letting some of what I'd been holding in come through. I know that probably sounds empty coming from a descendant of the same people responsible for it, but I promise you I mean it. That's why I do what I do. I want things to get better, You're just as much a part of this world as we are. Instead, it seems like things just keep getting worse, no matter how much I try to fix them. A muscle in his jaw feathered. Maybe it's not supposed to get better. That ever cross your mind? Not wanting this to turn into a fight, I continued as if he hadn't spoken, determined to say my piece. We've been going at it for almost a year now, and the way things have been, it seems like it'll never end. But in that time, we've also worked together. With the white stag, the false trees animals, the cookie hag, and between the boss and me, you keep trying to collect Orion employees, so you must not hate us as much as you say you do. That last statement managed to get a small snort out of him. The knot cat's tail also whipped in bemusement. It gave me the assurance to keep going. To top it off, you agreed to keep teaching me how to use a sword, which seems to benefit me much more than it does you. Again, I know the significance of being named. Some of your power has been stripped from you, but at the same time, if I hadn't bound you, we never would have gotten here. You could be dead right now, mechanic. So could Briar and the Houndmaster. His expression was grave again. However, in a shocking turn of events, he wasn't arguing with me or mocking me. I wasn't sure what that meant, so I gave the end of my thesis. At this point, Orion and your faction of the Wild Hunt are intertwined, probably indefinitely. It doesn't have to keep being a bad thing. He sat up, letting both hands drop to his knees. The knot cat had apparently gotten its fill, standing up with a stretch before languidly wandering off to sit on the ground nearby, tail curled around its paws. When Iolo finally spoke, it was hard to discern what he could have been feeling by his tone. You can't really think it's that easy, Fiona. No trace of his usual smile. The intensity in his gaze made maintaining eye contact difficult, but I managed to. I don't, I admitted. It's not going to be any easier for me. Do I have to go down the list of all the grudges I have against you? That's exactly what I mean, he said curtly. You can't bury the hatchet any more than I can. I stepped in front of you, didn't I reminded him softly. He had nothing to say to that. Briar's voice came from nowhere. Looks like I'm interrupting something. I whirled around, seeing that the hunter had appeared at the edge of the clearing, not in uniform for once. What is he doing here? The mechanic greeted him with a smile. Nah, you're just in time. You remember what we discussed earlier? Briar smirked in a way that made me nervous. Sure do, sir. Forget it, tell you later. Briar's left eyebrow rose, but he nodded, telling the mechanic that he understood. The mechanic winked at him. For whatever reason, that prompted Briar to glance briefly at me with a small, mischievous smile before he knelt beside the knot cat to PS at it. What's that about? The knot cat walked away, apparently not as keen on the other huntsman's affection as it had been the mechanic's. Briar shrugged, then straightened back up. Iolo's attention was back on me as he announced, no promises. What does that mean? I demanded skeptically. Exactly what it sounds like. Fiona, I'll give it a shot, but I ain't promising shit. I expect the same from you and yours, including that Keening woman. Bleh. Even though it was close enough to what I'd wanted to hear, sort of, something didn't feel right. They were both acting weird, and I definitely didn't trust that no promises bit. Eyes flitting between them both, I felt emboldened enough to question Iolo. If I ask you what's going on, will you tell me? He removed a four-leaf clover from the front pocket of his flannel, holding it out for me to take without uttering a word. A clear no. When the veil was pulled away, I saw the damage Wes did to his prosthetic wings. Along with that, I saw the damage the prosthetics were doing to Iolo. Jesus. Alarmed, I tore my gaze away from the raw, striated flesh, telling him without thinking, You shouldn't be pushing yourself like this. He scoffed. You sound like Briar. Well, maybe you should listen to him, I retorted. Briar chimed in, sounding relieved that someone else had acknowledged the mechanic's condition. Yes, listen to me. Nowadays, I'm pretty used to Iolo's true appearance. His teeth don't unnerve me nearly as much as they used to. Of course, I probably would be singing a different tune if I'd witnessed him using them to tear Wes's throat out. The mechanic cheerfully informed me, Oh, don't you worry. That is exactly why Briar here is going to be taken over, since the Houndmaster's out of town. I'm just here to spectate. Make sure he doesn't kill you. Hope you don't mind none. It dawned on me then that he wanted me to fight Briar, the hunter that can summon thorns at will. Thorns that siphon the blood from your body upon contact. He couldn't be serious. No, he was being serious. On that note, I'd forgotten how much more imposing Briar was behind his disguise. The thorns woven throughout his antlers and across his face somehow looked sharper than the last time I saw them. I'd only ever seen him use the hooks on his wings to hang on the church ceiling, but I didn't doubt that they would be deadly to deal with. The thorned hunter didn't have a sword in hand. Not promising. "You hope I don't mind if he kills me or if you spectate," I snapped. Briar cheekily replied, "Yes." Iolo raised a hand at him, saying dismissively, "Oh, he's just fucking with you. Told him to go easy on you." That was not reassuring. Going easy for the wild hunt simply meant that you'd have more of a chance of surviving long enough to get to a hospital than usual. "Oh, don't tell me you're scared, dog of Orion," Briar remarked with a dark laugh. "Course. Now you don't have a gun or a hagstone to hide behind like you did in the temple. Yet you have all those thorns to hide behind," I retorted, reaching for Ratcatcher. "Who?" The mechanic seemed far too entertained by this as he stood up, finding a place to rest off to the side so he could watch, arms crossed over his chest. "You gonna take that shit from a human, Briar?" "All I'll need is one," was the only warning Briar gave before those leathery wings flexed, bringing him by my side, that forked tongue flicking out at me menacingly. God, he's a creepy bitch. There was more movement in the corner of my eye. Ratcatcher's blade let out a heavy clang as it blocked a vine the diameter of my forearm, the force of the vine's lash rivaling that of the Dullahan's whip. I then had to yank the sword back as the thorns attempted to wrap around it. At the same time, I ducked away as Briar sought to drive the hook of his wing into my shoulder. This was going to be difficult. The thorned vine moved like a serpent through the air, while at the same time I had to avoid Briar as he alternated between trying to grab me and trying to skewer me with those wings. As much as being quite literally pinned by those hooks made me quiver, I was afraid to find out what would happen if he got his hands on me. "Stop running from him," the mechanic advised from the side. "Look at where you are, Fiona. That way you want to be." After ducking away from the thorns again, I spared a glance at my surroundings, realizing that Iolo was right. Briar was driving me into a thick cluster of trees, intending to corner me. Almost tripping over the vine as it tried to weave around my ankles, I flailed past my opponent, taking a slash at him to force him to keep his distance. He let the sword swipe past him. I had to dodge his hooks once again, but at least I managed to avoid that trap. "Good," the mechanic praised as I struggled to keep my feet under me after Briar smacked me on the back with the leather of his wing. "Now, I keep seeing you retreat. He ain't nearly as big and scary as he thinks he is. Don't be fluffing his ego. Lord knows it don't need to get any bigger." "You're one to talk." Without breaking eye contact with me, Briar took a second to raise two fingers in a V shape at Iolo, earning a snicker from his superior. The vine kept trying to circle around behind me, raising up to the height of my waist. It made me nervous. It wasn't being used as a whip anymore. It hit me that Briar was either trying to herd me closer to him or coil it around me. Either way, I had to get out of the semicircle it had formed. Briar spread his wings wide, completing the shape. "Shit. You heard him," he warned with a tilt of his head. "No more running." "All right, have it your way, fucker." I resisted the urge to rush at him, keeping Ratcatcher at the ready by my side, still acutely aware of the thorns behind me. Were they closer? They definitely seemed closer. Instinct kicked in. I dropped to the ground. The thorns swirled around where I'd just been standing. I rolled towards Briar just as they drove themselves downward in a drilling motion, tearing up the earth beneath them. I slashed sideways at him again, going for the symbols etched into his midriff, hoping to cross a few of them out. He jumped back. That gave me some clearance to get out of the snare I'd been in. Wait, no, it had to be another trick. It was too obvious. He wanted me to go there. I stuck with my original plan to gut him, trying another horizontal slash. He cackled, moving backwards again. "I thought for sure you'd fall for that." I went for his throat next, thinking that he and Victor should be twinsies. The vine fastened around my ankle, roughly yanking me to the ground. With a yelp, I swept Ratcatcher down to chop it, feeling the tips of the thorns poking through the leg of my jeans, not enough to break the skin, but enough to make me twitch. Movement. Above me. Using my free hand, I pushed myself to the side before Briar could get a hold of me. "You ain't thinking of doing what I think you are you, Briar?" Iolo asked, his voice absurdly playful given the circumstances. Directing his thorns to coil around both of my legs, Briar responded, "I might have been, if that's all right with you, sir." Oh God, what are they talking about now? To my distress, Iolo still sounded bemused as he told him, "Sure, long as you don't kill her, and don't injure her in a way she can't recover from in a few days. Means no broken bones." "You got it." I understood when Briar looked down at me to oh so casually ask, You aren't afraid of heights, are you? Eyes wide, heart racing, I shouted, "Oh, don't you fucking dare!" I swung Ratcatcher at him as he tried to go for me again, the hunter openly laughing at my reaction. "Oh, and Fiona," Iolo called, the smile in his voice increasing my nervousness. "If you can keep him from getting you in the air, it might inspire me to stick to what we spoke about before. Keep that in mind. Yins are a couple of fucking jagoffs." In hindsight, I think the mechanic was having Briar push my buttons on purpose, trying to get me to regret what we'd talked about, trying to prove that burying the hatchet wasn't a realistic option for either of us. I could tell by the way he watched us. It was as if he was waiting for something. However, that didn't occur to me at the moment, thanks to the highly stressful prospect of that fucker dropping me out of the sky. The vine wasn't coming off, keeping my legs bound together tightly. However, holding off the one controlling it was the bigger priority. Where Iolo put more emphasis on outmaneuvering his opponents, Briar appeared to be more focused on cornering his prey. It would be better if he thought I was trapped. I pretended to be more concerned with freeing myself from the thorns, lightly setting Ratcatcher against one of the tight coils above my knee. I pulled the sword away just as it wound itself around my non-dominant hand, gritting my teeth as an icy, siphoning sensation began in the palm of my hand. To Briar's eyes, wherever they were, I appeared to be too distraught with pain to think of fighting back anymore. He had the vine drag me closer to him, then reached down. Now, using all the strength in my core, I flung myself at him, Ratcatcher's blade grazing his wing. He couldn't fly without it, after all. When the iron touched his skin, he hissed inwardly, recoiling from it. He appeared to be more sensitive to iron than Iolo was, a horrible rash erupting on the leathery skin. Afterwards, his hands clenched into fists. Not long after, the ground began to shake. "Temper, Briar," Iolo warned him. The movement below the earth ceased. Even so, I kept my sword trained on the thorned hunter as he glowered at me. The sensation of the thorns draining my blood intensified until it became a harsh burn. To my relief, the mechanic had him release me, though Briar made a point to ensure that the thorn's exit from my flesh was as messy as possible, tearing skin, leaving long cuts. It took effort not to flinch. If only my blood would give him depression like Deirdre's did, or anxiety, I'd be more than happy to share that with him. He took in a deep inhale, rolling his neck, bouncing slightly on the balls of his feet. The tension began to drain from his shoulders. He released that breath before telling Iolo, "I'm all good now." The mechanic had slowly begun to pace. "All right, go again." "Hold on," I yelled, springing up from the ground. "Do the same conditions apply?" Seeming annoyed that I had the audacity to bring it up, Iolo flatly asked his colleague if he could still fly. Briar begrudgingly admitted that it wouldn't be a good idea. "Well, there you go," Iolo said brusquely. "Now, go again. And Fiona, that skittishness I just saw is fucking embarrassing for us both. Don't let it happen again." Bleh. He didn't have to tell me twice. We went a few more rounds. My review of training with Briar. I really missed the Houndmaster. Fingers crossed that she'll be back soon. Thankfully, my feet remained on the ground the whole time, mostly. Briar did pummel me a bit, though I was more scratched than bruised. It may sound odd, but I think I prefer the bruises. At least they don't itch as much afterwards. Eventually, the mechanic got sick of looking for something that he apparently wasn't finding. He let us quit for the night, dismissing his right-hand hunter. Wanting to try to get some clarity on the situation, I swiftly discarded the four-leaf clover, the reason being that it's easier to read the hunter's expressions when they're pretending to be human. At least, in Iolo's case it is. What I saw after the veil was back up was that Iolo looked mildly aggrieved to have Briar fussing over his injuries again. However, he sat still and let the other hunter examine him, the two speaking in Gaelic. Before he departed, Briar came dangerously close to complimenting me. "You aren't quite as terrible as I expected you to be." I bit back a rude comment, one that he absolutely deserved. Once he left us alone, I tried to get the mechanic to give me a straight answer. I bet Yins can guess how well that went. "So," I prodded him. He side-eyed me. "So what?" "You know what I'm asking about. Are you willing to do what we discussed or not?" He raised his eyebrows. "You still want to after all that? Guess you were serious." I fought the urge to roll my eyes. Of course I was. Annoyingly enough, his answer hadn't changed. "Like I said, no promises. But I'll give it a good old college try." "What would it take to make it a promise?" I questioned. "This is the best you're going to get from me," he replied impatiently. "After these past few months, you should be grateful I'm even giving you that much. Now, if you'll excuse me, I've been told that I need to get some rest. That was the end of that conversation. In some ways, my discussion with the mechanic went better than expected. In other ways, it was far less than ideal. On one hand, he'd considered my words without trying to trap me into a Faustian bargain. On the other hand, that meant that he wasn't bound to anything. This was all entirely on a whim. I'll try doesn't mean much coming from a creature like him. And that little moment Iolo had with Briar before handing me the clover made me uneasy as well. The hell was that about? I also can't help but think of what Deirdre said in her entry. Old things like him know how to wait. In summary, nothing is certain at the moment, and it's driving me up the wall. Naturally, I plan to tell my co-workers about this tomorrow. All I know is that I can always trust Iolo to be untrustworthy. So, how was your week? Hopefully less eventful than mine. We urgently need to discuss the dangers presented by Crossroads, especially with the temperatures dropping. To begin, I want to clarify that when I say Crossroads, I don't mean any intersection that you come across. If that were the case, most urbanized or suburban areas would be saturated with these types of places. An infested crossroads can best be described as an in-between space. It's not just one road cutting through, or even two. It is both roads at once, yet at the same time. The intersection can't truly belong to either one of those that feed into it. Because of this quality, they attract all sorts of oddities. They seem to occur mainly in rural areas, often places where blood has been spilled. During the day, these locations are generally safe, but they become more treacherous between sunset and sunrise, especially at midnight. This is thought to be due to the fact that those times I've just mentioned are also transitory periods. Sunset and sunrise are between night and morning, and midnight is the change from one day into another. I hope that makes sense. If this description seems confusing or vague, don't worry. You'll be able to feel these infested crossroads when you encounter them. And most of the time, as long as you keep driving and mind your own business, you won't experience any trouble by simply passing through. More often than not, they're just trying to get from point A to point B, same as you. When I get into what happened to me on Friday, I will describe that feeling so that yins know what to look out for. So, what kind of atypical organisms hang around this habitat? It tends to vary depending on region. For example, one of the pest control companies down in Georgia frequently has to deal with devils at their infested crossroads, mostly targeting musicians. Meanwhile, our crossroads appear to be a rest stop of sorts. We don't get too many that linger for more than a day or two. Most of the time, these things tend to mind their own business. As long as you don't bother them, they won't bother you. That being said, some are more predisposed to aggression than others. Our most dangerous travelers tend to appear during winter. When it snows, you can see silhouettes. Sometimes they look humanoid, other times the shapes are long and writhing. And if you're unlucky enough to find yourself close to them, you can see faces outlined by the falling snowflakes. For whatever reason, these snow people only appear during when, you guessed it, snow is actively falling. The heavier the snowfall, the more prominent they become. While driving, the snow people can be extremely difficult to spot. They have been known to mess with cars in a variety of ways, from relatively minor but still dangerous inconveniences such as generating thick sheets of ice near infested intersections to more severe assaults. I experienced the latter while driving back to the office during an early morning call last Friday. It was just past dawn, so the sun had only begun to ascend into the sky. Gripping the steering wheel tighter, I slowed down as I approached the stop sign, mentally preparing myself for the worst as I reached what I knew was an infested crossroads. Have you ever found yourself in a remote area, looking for more than just cars as you wait, knowing that there is something else out there, even if you can't see it? The air has an electric feel to it, as if there is a storm looming overhead. You become more alert as the hairs on the back of your neck start to rise. Shadows seem longer and darker, no matter what time of day, as you check the intersection once, twice, 3 times. But no matter where you look, there's still nothing there, or it's just hiding. That is what an infested crossroads feels like. It's a sensation you can't forget once you experience it. My eyes darted around the intersection. Snowflakes lightly danced across the truck's hood. Out where I was, there weren't any streetlights to give me much visibility in the early morning light. The wheat fields swayed in the wind, illuminated only by the company truck's headlights. With how early it was, there weren't any cars around. I watched the snow carefully, not seeing any shapes. There were no signs of danger that I could see, but that didn't mean that I was safe. Just as I started to accelerate, the company truck bounced violently enough to make the suspension squeak. My breath caught when I glanced into the rearview mirror. The bed. Something had climbed into the bed. I stepped on it while turning the wheel from side to side, hoping that my unwelcome passenger would lose its balance and tumble out. The truck's tires screeched, skidding on a light patch of ice, but thankfully regaining traction. The frame rocked some more as whatever was back there held on, pulling itself towards the rear window. In the mirror, there was only a heavy shape outlined by the snowflakes whizzing past. Once I got some speed, I slammed on the brakes, hearing the visitor falter and bump into the back of the cab. The tires complained again, as I then put the gas pedal to the metal. Afterwards, there were a series of loud thumps leading away from the cab as the thing rolled out. In the faint glow provided by the truck's taillights, I caught a glimpse of the snow person using what looked to be a hook-like appendage to catch onto what I would later learn was the truck's rear axle. Swearing, I swerved, trying to wrench it loose. When the snow person roared, it sounded like it was trying its best to imitate a human scream. Though with how flat and low the tone was, it missed the mark, causing goosebumps to appear on my arms. There was an ear-splitting screech as metal bent. The truck had begun to wobble. I hit the brakes again, then threw it in reverse in the hopes of running my assailant over. The truck bounced violently as I backed up on top of the snow person, then again when I shifted back into drive. As I made my daring escape, there was a sticky blue substance smeared all over the road. That's one way to take care of a snow person, I suppose. However, I also noticed a problem as I navigated away from the intersection. Something was grinding. I'm not a car person by any stretch of the imagination, but even I knew it was a bad sound for a truck to make. And I was in the middle of nowhere. I drove it as far away from the Crossroads as the truck could manage, wanting to get as much distance on the snow people as possible. Our poor company vehicle shuddered the entire time, steadily beginning to feel worse and worse with each passing meter. I was cursing up a storm and crossing my fingers, nervously checking the mirrors, on high alert for any more shapes in the snow. There weren't any nearby, thankfully. Eventually, I got too scared to try to push it any further. After I finally gave in and stopped, the first thing I did was lock the doors. Then I called Victor to let him know what happened. After saying that he'd be out as soon as he could, he voiced my thoughts perfectly. Fucking snow people. Yeah, we love them back at the office. They're a pain in the ass. I'm so glad they're only a seasonal issue. Unlike other atypical beings that reside around these parts, we have yet to find a way to deal with snow people in a way that doesn't end in violence. As demonstrated, they attack without any provocation. They've been known to drag people from their cars, never to be seen again. Allow me to reiterate, if Yins see shapes in the snow, get as far away as possible. Other protective measures include salt, who could have seen that coming, and as well as anything else you could use to melt the snow outlining their bodies. Namely, fire has been effective for the larger, less humanoid snow people. As far as the truck dilemma went, my problems weren't resolved yet. The next step was to find a towing company. Unfortunately, most of them didn't open until later in the morning, but there was one 24-hour towing service that I knew of, and I really did not want to dial them up. Warily, I glanced back towards the Crossroads. While I couldn't see anything, we saw how well that went for me last time. Before making the call, I anxiously double-checked that my fake ID was still in my wallet, despite knowing I never left home without it. After the mechanic learned my father's name with something as innocuous as a car title, the idea of some other slip-up occurring has haunted me. I really should go back to therapy. However, that takes time and money, and at the moment I'm short on both. When I called Dubnos Towing, it wasn't Briar that answered, to my relief. It was a deep-voiced, monotone woman who sounded as if she was positively thrilled to be awake and working this early in the day. After I explained the situation, I politely asked, "Is it possible to know the name of the driver picking me up beforehand?" "Sure," she answered flatly. "It's Chuck." Recalling that Briar's nickname was embroidered onto his work shirt, I started to relax until it occurred to me that there was no guarantee that Chuck was human, or the woman I spoke to on the phone for that matter. On high alert, I gave her the name on my fake ID, telling her where the truck had broken down at. However, at the same time, what wild huntsman would go by the name Chuck? Disclaimer, if there is anyone reading this named Chuck, I swear, I'm not making fun of you. It's just not an alias I'd expect a powerful neighbor to pick. Thankfully, she accepted the fraudulent name without hesitation, informing me that Chuck would be there in about half an hour. Cool. Just had to hope nothing else from the Crossroads decided to have a go at me. For the most part, snow people don't stray too far from the Crossroads. I just hoped I was far enough away that none of them could reach me to finish what the one had started. And before Yins ask where the snow people come from or what causes them to be drawn towards certain crossroads, let me save you the trouble. Nobody knows. All that is understood about them is that they're elusive, highly malevolent, and can only appear during an active snowfall. Now you all know as much as I do. While waiting inside the truck with nothing to do but try to stay warm as I stared vacantly at the grey sky, I found myself becoming somewhat antsy due to my circumstances. Granted, I think it's fair to say that constant paranoia is part of the job description of an Orion employee. Should probably turn the lights off. Don't need the battery dying on top of whatever else is going on. As I reached for the stick thing behind the steering wheel to turn off the headlights, something caught my attention. Eyes in the wheat field nearby. They reflected the headlights. An animal. I furrowed my brow, pulling back on the stick to turn on the truck's brights. Oh, fuck. Whatever was in the wheat, there was more than one of them. The plants couldn't have much more than 4 feet in height. Even though my mysterious audience would have been roughly the same height as a typical kindergartner, that wasn't any comfort. Terrible things can come in small packages, especially where the neighbors are concerned. Telling myself they were just coyotes, I turned the lights off. The doors were locked. I had salt. I had Ratcatcher. Vic was on his way. Everything was going to be fine, yet my hands were shaking, and it wasn't from the cold. Half a paranoia-filled hour later, I saw flashing yellow lights standing out against the gloom of the day. Squinting against them, I recognized the black tow truck accented with blue lightning. The wheat rustled as those that were hiding within it retreated. Dubnos is prompt, I'll give them that. When the driver emerged, the first thing I saw was a reflective, high-visibility jacket that practically glowed against the gloom of the day. The driver had his hood up. His build was, unfortunately, familiar. A pit appeared in my stomach as he got closer, revealing that Briar was the one who'd showed up after all. His eyelids looked heavy, face drawn in exhaustion. In short, he looked done. Rubbing his eyes, he knocked on the company truck's driver's side window with the knuckles of 2 fingers to greet me, his voice raspy. Good morning, to all those who celebrate. Bleh. Reluctantly, I rolled it down as I balked. I thought it was supposed to be... Well, Chucky's wife went into labor, so it got pawned off onto me, and I was supposed to be off an hour ago. Overtime for the 2nd week in a row. Ye fucking whore. Clearly, Briar was having a normal one. With the mental state he was in, I thought it best not to provoke him. Without another word, I removed Ratcatcher from the passenger side, then handed him the truck's keys without fuss so that he could do his job. All the while, I was quietly hoping that Vic would get there sooner rather than later. While I'm not as intimidated by Briar as I am his superior, I'll admit that I still don't feel safe around him. Those thorn scratches were still healing after all. While messing with chains and other towing doohickeys that I don't care enough to look up the proper names for, he made casual small talk about how he had to come out to the Crossroads recently to pick up someone who hit a nasty pothole that nearly ate their car. I didn't bother hiding my skepticism at his unexpected amiability. He broke character to sigh impatiently. Don't look at me with that face. I'm on the clock. It'd be a bit suspicious if I went to pick you up and something happened to you, wouldn't it? That was true. He continued. Right now, you're just my customer, and I'm your friendly neighborhood tow truck driver. Nothing weird. Once he was done, he looked at me expectantly, seeing if I accepted this temporary truce, or if I wanted to send him off and wait for another towing company to come out there. Eventually I nodded, albeit reluctantly, and agreed. Nothing weird. After that, he went back to doing his relatively harmless day job. Even so, I kept an eye on him at all times. The tow truck began to roar as it pulled our company vehicle onto its massive bed. Anxiously, I risked looking away from Briar to briefly check my phone. Nothing from the boss yet. God, where was he? So, while I've got you here, Briar began, his tone mild as if he were planning to keep talking about mundane things like potholes. There's something that's been confusing me about you. Your colleagues, too. Brow furrowed, I replied. And what's that? It would have been so easy to just let the hag take care of us. So why didn't you? That seemed to come from nowhere, but it must have been on his mind for a while. Such heavy questions don't just spawn from the void. Caught off guard, it took me a minute to think of the best way to respond. Eventually, I settled for open honesty. I can't speak for anyone else, but personally, I've seen a lot of pain in my life. Because of that, I have this weird thing where I don't like seeing others suffer, you and your colleagues included. He snorted rudely, the friendly neighborhood tow truck driver act momentarily forgotten. Sounds fake, but all right. You'd know if I was lying, I pointed out somewhat defensively. And like it or not, that's what happened. You don't have to agree with it, but it's the truth. He let out a harsh breath, becoming intensely focused on making sure that the chain and other things were taut enough. His jaw was tight, as if chewing over what I'd said. Thinking is pretty difficult if you're not used to it, I guess. Probably got a migraine afterwards. When Briar finally revealed what was going on in his head, I got the impression that saying the following words evoked a similar sensation to prying out his own teeth. It was good of you, stepping in front of the captain like that. I did a double take. It had been a long day, and it wasn't even 8 in the morning. Did he just thank me? Completely dumbfounded and staring like an idiot caught in the headlights, I stammered, "It was good of you to not let your friends kill my co-workers." Seemingly satisfied with the company truck's position, Briar pressed a button to make the obnoxious roaring stop. Meanwhile, I was amazed at what had just transpired, not entirely sure that conversation hadn't been the product of stress and sleep deprivation. On Briar's end, he seemed equally perplexed as he recovered from the incredibly difficult task of being nice. Headlights shone through the snow flurry. Victor, thank goodness. I nearly jumped out of my skin when the tow truck's passenger side door suddenly slammed shut. Not even a second afterwards, Briar was leaning against the side of the tow truck's cab, sipping a Red Bull. God, I hate it when they move like that. Expecting someone? The hunter questioned, his typical attitude returning as if the earlier exchange had never happened. Are you that afraid to be alone with me? It's not my truck, I reminded him, having to use immense restraint to refrain from saying something rude. The boss needed to know sooner rather than later. Briar's annoyed expression slowly morphed into a smirk. Oh, the big guy's coming. That made my brows furrow. Why did he say it like that? For Vic's sake, I told the hunter flatly. I thought you said nothing weird. He rolled his eyes. Chill. I'm just admiring the view. Don't tell me you haven't noticed. You work with the guy, after all. I grimaced, the thought of being intimate with the Draugr that I consider an older brother filling me with genuine revulsion. No offense to Vic. He'd have the exact same reaction if someone were to make a similar suggestion to him about me. A Rayner line seemed the most fitting way to respond. Sir, this is a Wendy's. As an aside, it truly can't be emphasized enough how much that woman has transformed the way we all speak. Sometimes for the better, sometimes for the worst. Yes, Wes, I'm talking about you. While Briar rolled his eyes again, Vic's vehicle slowed to a stop, the gravel crunching under his tires. Gonna have to warn the boss about that later. The boss appeared to be just as drained as Briar was, looking even more sickly than usual in the glow of the tow truck's flashing yellow lights. In his haste, he'd neglected his bandana, the wound across his throat making me shudder. It looked like he's recently tried to sew it shut with some red thread. He'd done an all-right job, though some places were definitely tighter than others. You're not hurt, are you? He asked, scanning the company truck where it sat. I told him I wasn't. That didn't seem to help him relax any. It's going to the captain's shop, right? Briar inquired after another gulp of his energy drink. The boss nodded at him, glancing around warily. He got close to whisper to me, "We need to get away from this area." I checked the wheat field again. No eyes. No shapes in the snow either. Maybe the Crossroads pests weren't what the boss was concerned about. From the way he kept looking at Briar from the corner of his eye, I could tell whatever was bothering him, he didn't want to discuss with the hunter present. Thankfully, the problem took care of itself. Well, Briar announced, downing the rest of the Red Bull, I don't know about you two, but I've got better things to do besides sit here, so I'm going to take this where it needs to go. Call the captain later to see when he can have it done. With that, he hopped back into the driver's seat. Vic and I rushed to his S10 as the tow truck's yellow light began to get further away. The boss didn't waste time getting it started. I noticed he kept checking his rearview mirror. Once we were on the road, far enough away from the crossroads that I felt somewhat safer, I asked, "Is there something I should know?" He revealed that he'd found a deer skull, its empty eye sockets inlaid with the same blue crystals that Gwyn ap Nudd had woven into his hair and antlers on Samhain. I didn't know what it meant at the time, he explained. At first I thought it was a threat, but after some digging, it appears to mean that we've gotten the favor of the White Son of Mist, probably because of everything that happened on Halloween. That being said, I still don't know what that approval will do for us in the grand scheme of things. Life could get easier, or it could get harder this coming winter. For background, the boss is neither religious nor spiritual, never has been. Dying only seemed to make him more cynical in that regard. However, after finding that skull, He begrudgingly began researching what offerings were common for practitioners to give to the White Son of Mist. That prompted me to question, so, does Orion have a patron deity right now, or just you? He shrugged resignedly. Again, I just found the thing. My plan right now is simply to try my best not to invoke any wraths. Maybe one of our friends could fill us in. I have training later today, so I can see if any of them will tell me anything, I offered. I figured there was no better time than the present to tell Vic about Briar's reaction towards him, though I probably could have been more delicate about it. Oh, and just so you know, I think Briar is horny for you. Welcome to Huntsman Hell, buddy. But where's the fun in being delicate? I can't be the only one suffering after all. Misery loves company. His response to that news was to release a breath that sounded like it came from the depths of his soul as he shook his head. When we got back to the office to explain what happened, Deirdre shared something valuable with all of us that I believe Yins should know, too. If any of you ever find yourselves below the Mounds, look for a crossroads. While they can be dangerous, they are one of the only doorways into our world that will permit mortals free passage. The mushrooms and the trees are loyal only to those below the Mounds. Good to know. The last thing anyone wants is to end up stuck in their world. While it hasn't happened to anyone at Orion yet, the way things have been going, I figure it's only a matter of time. To summarize the truck's condition, its rear axle got messed up. Vic told us he'd be able to pick it up the following day. In the meantime, he would be compensating us for gas for having to use our own vehicles for work. As of now, the truck is back in service, good as new. Say what you will about the mechanic, he knows what he's doing. Before I get into what happened when I asked him about the skull, I have an update about Deirdre, and it's a pretty major one. She wants to cut her ties to the river tomorrow. We've been preparing for it as much as we can. She already has one hagstone on a pendant. Along with that, she had the clever idea to sew a spare one into the hem of an article of clothing that I won't reveal here. This way, it'll be harder for the hunters and those under their influence to find it. As silly as it sounds, none of us have ever thought to do something like that. It's simple, yet brilliant. I know hagstones aren't perfect protection. The hunt has been more than happy to exploit their weaknesses time and time again, but they're still invaluable. And as of right now, I'm not sure what other protective measures to take. Aren't you scared? I'd asked her while she was sealing the hagstone into the fabric of her garment. Morbidly, I wondered if she could help Victor sew his neck shut. I am, she admitted, focused on her work. Believe me, I am. Yet I still fear being a weeper forever more than I do death. Is that strange of me? Maybe it should have been reassuring that no matter what happens, at least she'll be free. But it wasn't. Even as I write this out, I feel sick when I consider the possibility of losing her. It makes me want to scream. Her life hinges on I'll try, Jesus fucking Christ. I promised her then that no matter what, I'd do my best to protect her. Instantly, Deirdre set her needle down and pulled me close to whisper, I want you to promise me something else instead, Nessa. Interlacing my fingers with hers, I asked her what that was. I know you, Nessa. Her voice was quiet, yet firm. Sometimes, you forget to prioritize yourself first. I want you to do that for me. She wasn't wrong. Rather than admitting it, I let out a sigh that matched with how tired I was. I didn't have to confirm what we both already knew. From the beginning, I knew our relationship would never be simple. However, there was always some naive part of me that wanted to believe that over time, things would get easier. No, I need to stop thinking like this, like she's on death row awaiting her execution date. I'm still going to do what I can, I told her, shaking off the momentary feeling of hopelessness that I'd allowed to seep into my thoughts. But I'll be careful. Bleh. She gently insisted, if it ever comes down to me or you, choose you. We kissed then. I wonder if when everything is all said and done, she'll regain the ability to feel. I hope so. It doesn't seem fair that I'm the only one who can enjoy physical contact. It feels selfish. The other thing I've been doing in regards to Deirdre's conundrum is monitoring the mechanic's demeanor during our training sessions, trying to get an idea of what could be going through his mind, seeing how much he'd feel inclined to try. In an attempt to encourage him, I've been bringing offerings in the hopes of improving relations between Orion and the Wild Hunt. The first time, it was a batch of homemade shortbread cookies, my grandmother's recipe. Along with that, I brought along a bottle of Jameson. As I've said in the past, I'm not much of a drinker, but when I do, it's this. Whiskey and shortbreads pair really well together. When I approached the mechanic with the Tupperware and liquor, his eyes immediately narrowed. scrutinizing the containers as if he expected them to explode. "This is an offering given freely with no expectation of reciprocation," I told him, doing a decent job of not sounding like I'd rehearsed the words a few times in an effort to get them right. "Is it now?" he said with an infuriating smile. "You poison them or some shit." Truth be told, I had been expecting this. From what I can tell, it's not common for the hunters to receive gifts without any strings attached. I assured him, "You know I'm not the type to do that. They're regular old shortbread cookies, just trying to be nice is all." He continued to stare at me as if trying to pry my skull open with his eyes. When that didn't work, he goaded me. "You want something, I know you do." Not taking the bait, I shook my head. "Sorry to disappoint. I'm honestly just trying to build some goodwill here." "Oh, I getcha." His smile grew, eyes still slitted in suspicion. "Fine, I'll take 'em." When I handed them off, he inspected one of the cookies. "Don't these usually have salt in 'em?" I informed him. "Not this batch. I am well aware of your food sensitivities. On that note, it's also made with unsalted butter." A crow descended from one of the skull trees to perch on the mechanic's wrist. Both he and I watched as the bird took a bite out of the shortbread. Its dark head tilted back, swallowing the piece it had taken in the blink of an eye. It looked up to him afterwards, beak open as if gaping at him dumbly. Naturally, nothing happened. Satisfied, the mechanic raised his arm, letting the crow fly away with the rest of it. "I know you ain't cowardly enough to try it," Iolo told me before sampling one of the shortbreads, "but mistakes can happen, and it's always possible for a certain someone else to add an extra ingredient when your back's turned, if you know what I mean." He'd wanted to get a reaction out of me with that last comment. I wouldn't give it to him. But unfortunately, Iolo seemed to be aware that he'd gotten under my skin anyway, judging by the wink and self-satisfied smirk I received. Am I that predictable? I must be. As far as the rest of that session went, it started with good news. The Houndmaster is back, thank God. She mainly has been taking over training while Iolo's mother medic keeps him restricted to the sidelines. She was trying to work with me on parrying attacks. Truth be told, I'm not very good at it yet. Deflecting an opponent is a lot more complicated than other things we've worked on thus far. Requires a lot of timing and precision. And in the midst of all of that, I regularly get the pleasure of hearing the mechanic and Briar bickering over Iolo's healing progress. "They're fine, Briar. Now if you want to keep fondling me, you best buy me a drink first, making me feel cheap." The Houndmaster went for a vertical strike, which I skirted around, taking the opportunity to jab towards her dominant arm. She gracefully ducked away before Ratcatcher could touch her. "Yes, they are fine. For the moment." Briar spoke as if he were addressing an excitable toddler. "But if you do too much too soon, you'll fuck them up again." "I know. Why you think I'm here and not over there, boy?" I attempted to deflect another vertical strike like she'd been showing me. The timing wasn't quite right, but at least I managed to block it before getting whacked in the forehead. As a result, this brought us into close proximity with one another as our blades crossed. It was then that I heard the Houndmaster sigh under her breath, like children. There was a pause in her colleagues' back and forth. The mechanic's tone was light-hearted as he called her out. "You talking shit over there?" The Houndmaster shoved me back, not looking away from me as she responded evenly, "Always am, sir." He chuckled. "I see we're full of piss and vinegar today. Fiona boring you, Houndmaster? You need a bit more of a challenge?" It took so much strength not to roll my eyes. "She's doing fine," the Houndmaster replied. "But now that you mention it, I believe a demonstration of what is expected of her would be beneficial." "Wait, someone besides me is getting beaten up for once?" Iolo didn't move away from where he leaned. The prosthetic wings no longer drooped like plants that hadn't been watered properly. They had also regained their dark red color, as opposed to the wilted brown that they had been since Samoin. Even so, from what I overheard, he still wasn't in any shape to be fighting. He nodded, then waved me over. "You're gonna want to be out of the way for this, Fiona." Once I saw her and Briar face off, I was glad he'd pulled me aside. While I've never seen myself fight, I imagine that it's not the prettiest picture. Despite becoming more and more comfortable wielding Ratcatcher after each session, I don't have the movements and techniques memorized to the point where they come naturally to me. I imagine that to the hunters, I must look more like a blindfolded kid swinging at a piñata rather than a swordswoman. Meanwhile, their expertise is clear in every move they make. The Houndmaster effortlessly sidestepped each of the vines as if they were moving around her in slow motion. Yet at the same time, she couldn't land a hit on Briar, the thorned hunter always seeming to be 2 steps ahead of her. And he didn't do any taunting bullshit against her like he did with me, most likely because he has more respect for her. They're going slow, so you can actually see what's happening, so I hope you're paying close attention." The mechanic remarked. That sharp, permanent grin pointed in my direction. "I am," I replied bluntly. While I was sidelined with him, it seemed like a decent opportunity to ask about the skull the boss found on his porch. The entire time, I made sure to keep my attention on the jewel in front of me. I brought it up as casually as I could. "Ain't it obvious?" He somehow was capable of nibbling a shortbread gently with those monstrous teeth. "You'll impress the White Son of Mist. You know, in the old days, we used to look for warriors' souls. The wicked and the weak were just for fun. Nowadays, that's all we get. All blue eyes and your bloodsucker actually gave us something to work with." We'd figured that already, so this confirmation wasn't news. That still didn't answer the burning question we had. "So, what now?" I asked apprehensively. "Just keep up the good work. Keep treating the Mound folk the same way you have been. Don't change a single thing." Since that gave me absolutely nothing, I decided to ask the real question. Does the White Son of Mist have something in mind for us? "I ain't at liberty to say," he told me curtly. "Now pay attention." The Houndmaster charged past a tunnel of thorns, then ducked under Briar's wing as he thrusted that hook at her. This left him open. She slashed towards his chest, smacking him right over where his most vital organs would be. If she'd been using a real sword, he wouldn't be standing. Both of them were breathing hard and tired after the fact. Through all of her patience, she'd won. They expect me to be able to do all of that. Maybe in a decade, I'll have the confidence and techniques down to pure instinct, if I'm lucky to survive that long. The way things have been going, I've come to terms with the fact that making it to middle age in this line of work is a luxury, but there is no conceivable way for a human to move like they do, even a well-trained one. Briar took his loss in stride, offering her a pleasant, "That was fun." In turn, she nodded respectfully to him. "You're a pain in the ass, as always, and I mean that as a compliment." As Briar strode back, I felt something nudge the back of my shoulder. Iolo had given me a light shove with one of his good wings. I wasn't shy about shooting him a disapproving look. "You've rested long enough," he said, ignoring my expression. "Hopefully that was educational for you." Back to parrying. With a heavy sigh, I rejoined the Houndmaster, silently hoping that Briar wore her out enough to give me a decent chance of performing better. It did help somewhat. While she wasn't slowed down any, she did seem less tense, so I suppose it evened out. That was all a few days back. Still, no light has been shed about the skull situation. I haven't bothered trying to question Iolo on it anymore. He'd made it clear that his lips were sealed. While we're on the subject, I think now would be a good time to give Yins a little history lesson on the White Son of Mist. Don't worry, I'll keep it brief. This is not just for your benefit. I'm hoping that his past could give me some sort of clue as to what his intentions could be. Back before human beings understood what causes the change of seasons, they told themselves stories. There had to be a reason why the world suddenly became much darker and colder, why famine and sickness became more common. The winter months used to be a deadly time for our ancestors. With crops being frozen and animals going into hiding, food was scarce. The weather was harsh. Illness and death were as common in winter as a fresh bed of snow. It only seemed reasonable that the god that brought about such trifling conditions would have the propensity to be just as cold as the season he represented. The trouble began when Gwyn ap Nudd's lover and sister, according to some historians, Creedilad, had fallen in love. Namely, fallen in love with someone who wasn't him. On the night that she was due to be married to the King of Summer, Gwitha ap Grydol, Gwyn swooped in and abducted her, stealing her away to Anwan to make her his. Naturally, Gwitha was furious and gathered his warriors to rescue her. However, he and his band weren't a match for the wild hunt. And of course, Gwyn couldn't simply win the battle and be done with it. Oh no. He also felt the need to hold some of Gwitha's noblemen hostage, the two most notable prisoners being a father and son. In true huntsman fashion, Gwyn cut the father's heart out and force-fed it to the son. The boy apparently went mad afterwards. Can only imagine why. It was at that point that the infamous King Arthur finally decided to intervene. In his infinite wisdom, Arthur told Creedilad's suitors that the only way to settle this dispute was to do battle every Callan Mai, otherwise known as Beltane, which falls upon May 1st, to compete for her love. An annual war that is to be honored until Judgment Day, when a victor is finally decided. In the meantime, their object of desire was to return to her father. Even now she waits. Sounds like a ridiculous arrangement to me, but what do I know? I'm just a pest control specialist. And since both Gwyn and Gwythyr were at the behest of King Arthur, they were obligated to agree, though I imagine neither of them could have been happy about this either. A true nobody wins scenario. Brilliant, Arthur. Just brilliant. When it comes to this tale, I often wonder about Creedy Lad. Didn't anyone stop to think about what she'd wanted? Does she feel trapped in this cycle? Does she dread Judgment Day? Or does she look forward to an eventual end to the bloodshed, as well as reunion with one of her suitors? Or maybe she's sick of both of their shit and wants to live alone in a cabin with 30 cats. Sorry for the tangent. I've just got a lot of thoughts about Creedy Lad. Anyways, what could this mean for us in the upcoming winter? The White Son of Mist had seemed especially interested in Victor during the Samhain encounter, enough that he didn't want the boss killed. He must need him for something, but for what? What could a god possibly want with a grouchy Draugr? Truthfully, I don't know where I'm going with this speculation. All I can say for sure is that I'm worried about the White Son of Mist's motivations towards my boss as well as my company. I'm also concerned about how his involvement may influence the mechanic to be even more of a menace to society than he already is. When it comes to Iolo saying he'd try, I don't think that has any merit when it comes to the whims of his king. If his leader tells him to do something, he'll have no other choice but to do it. His loyalty and obligations to the hunt will outweigh anything we've discussed. If I find anything more about anything I've brought up in this post, I'll let Yins know. I'll also be sure to tell you all about how Deirdre's final keening session goes. Everything has gone wrong, but not in the way I'd expected it to. Clearly, it wasn't as bad as it could have been since I'm alive and here to type this up, but still far less than ideal. For starters, I got taken below the Mounds on the day I was supposed to go with Deirdre to escort the last soul to the other side. Orion had a call for a raccoon that was trying to make a nest in someone's garage. Nothing too spectacular, just a run-of-the-mill garbage kitty looking for somewhere warm for the winter. All that needed to be done was to set a trap, which we'd accomplished when the client called 3 days prior, and pick up the cage when it took the bait. Tell Yins what, though, the little jagoff was not thrilled about it. It screeched and reached its paws out to try to grab my hand every time I moved the cage. It's genuinely impressive how much rage those things can store into their tiny bodies. All that was left to do was release the angry little shit into the woods. On another note, it's been getting frigid out here lately. With how much time I spend outside or in poorly insulated areas, I've been needing to wear layers. Case in point, when I journeyed deep enough into the forest to release the little menace somewhere more suitable for it, my breath was visible. Crack! Apprehensively, I glanced over my shoulder, placing my free hand on Ratcatcher's hilt. The noise had come from behind me. However, when I turned, nothing was there. No birds were chirping. Everything around me was still. Even the raccoon had gone quiet. All bad signs. Slowly, I bent down to set the cage on the ground, listening. Whatever it was, it didn't want to be noticed. With one hand, I undid the latches on the raccoon's prison, giving it the chance to run free before whatever was stalking me decided to come out of hiding. There was the slightest crunch as my invisible stalker shifted its weight. It was closer than I'd anticipated. On the off chance it wasn't dangerous, I didn't immediately strike at it. The last thing I wanted was to slice someone or something open that didn't mean me any harm. Instead, I waited for it to make a move. Please show yourself, I commanded sternly. For a solid 5 minutes, we both stood completely still, it blatantly refusing to come out of hiding, me cautiously waiting. I tried to be patient. Really, I did. I even tried coaxing it back out again to no avail. Eventually, that patience ran out. When I marched over to the copse where it had concealed itself, the first thing I saw was light hair. A human. It launched itself at me. Out of reflex, I swung Ratcatcher, but when I saw its face, I diverted my attack. My face, it was wearing my face. At least it was supposed to be me, but it hadn't quite gotten it right yet. The features were still sliding into place. Everything appeared to be too loose and somewhat lumpy. I'm not a looker by any stretch of the imagination, but at least I don't look like I'm made of papier-mâché. The eyes were all wrong too. Black voids encapsulated my sockets with no separation between the pupil or iris. One was also significantly larger than the other, the left roughly the size of a golf ball, the right as small as a marble. I'd never seen a replacement in the midst of a transformation before, and I'm not in any hurry to see it again. There was a strange smell in the air, fungal, earthy. Quickly, I found myself becoming dizzy. Alarmed, I held my sleeve over my nose and mouth, trying not to inhale while simultaneously trying to keep the replacement back with the sword. Abandoning the cage, I hastily retreated. My sleeve wasn't enough. The world had begun to tilt. The replacement simply ambled after me, the resemblance between us becoming more and more uncanny with each passing minute. "You're making a mistake." My shout was muffled as I tried to cover my airways. I was even more unnerved to discover that it had already mastered my cadence perfectly when it spoke. "Am I?" Replacements, as the name implies, are the ultimate identity thieves. They find someone to abduct into the Mounds with the intent to disguise themselves as their victim, in an effort to take over the unfortunate individual's life. Ordinarily, they seem more inclined to take children. There is a lot of speculation as to why this is, one of them being that replacements want to be cared for by loving parents, though it should also be mentioned that there are records of replacements taking the place of children in abusive homes in order to terrorize the poor kids' tormentors. I have to wonder if another reason why they may gravitate towards kids is because it's easier. No bills, no jobs, no real worries besides making sure Mum doesn't catch you reading Percy Jackson by flashlight past your bedtime. I wouldn't necessarily say adult abductions are rare, they just aren't quite as common. Like I said, grown-ups are more difficult thanks to all of the responsibilities and expectations of adulthood. It can be a tall order for a neighbor that doesn't know much about human life to figure out all at once. On top of that, people are also more likely to notice drastic personality changes in adults more than children, which adds to the complexity. From what I can tell, taking over an adult's life seems to be a bragging right for these neighbors. I could imagine that impersonating a pest control specialist would be an even more impressive feat for them. Shaking my head against the spins, I tried to reason with it. My co-workers will know that something's up, and you would not like my boss when he's angry. "Thanks for your concern, but I can manage," the not-nesser said in a bored tone of voice that made me regret not slicing it initially. I held on to consciousness, stumbling a bit as I failed to get any distance on the replacement. I took a swipe at it, but with how the fungal shit in the air was affecting my vision, the blade was nowhere close to finding its mark. My next attempt was equally as clumsy. At that point I was seeing double. The ground came up fast and suddenly bruising my rear end, but despite knowing that I was about to be dragged into the Mounds, I had started to laugh. A hysterical, empty sound that made my stomach hurt. Was I giddy from whatever I was breathing in? That would make the most sense. Then the world spiraled into darkness, and that was that. When my eyes opened, I was greeted by purple flowers, the same shade as the sky when the sun sets in winter. Their dense, spiky petals looked like nothing I'd ever seen before. Along with that, the plant's stems were a bizarre shade of blue. Poking between the canopy of petals above me, the sky above glittered. But it was strange. The constellations were wrong. Ursa Major should have been visible right above my head. As my eyes focused on what I'd originally thought to be stars, I discovered that the violet and silver lights far above me were moving. For a moment, I was baffled, convinced that this was a byproduct of huffing whatever mycotic fumes the replacement had been producing. No matter how many times I blinked or where I looked, the shimmers continued to shift gently like the waves of a calm sea. It was then that I knew where I was, the Mounds. Even before the fear settled in, breathing was difficult. The air felt heavier and more sparse, as if there wasn't enough of it to go around. At first I thought it was another potential side effect. I sat up, hoping that would help get more oxygen into my lungs. It didn't. Once upright, I found that I was laying in a field, rows upon rows of those strange flowers, stretched as far as I could see along the landscape's rolling hills. The only landmark in sight was a massive tree. It stood tall and crooked, its branches plumed with broad white petals that fluttered gently in the wind. But how could there be wind? I was below the ground, wasn't I? Something hung from the tree, swaying languidly with the breeze. With the shock of my circumstances, it took a moment for it to register that it was a body dangling from a noose. Not just one, 4 more undulated in the wind. Humans. They were humans. I'm confident about that. Neighbors wouldn't have any reason to disguise themselves down there, especially not in death. I need to get out of here right now. Shaking, I looked around before rising to my feet, praying that whatever had strung those poor souls up wasn't nearby. To my knowledge, I was alone, save for the canopy of shimmers far above me. Whatever they were, they didn't seem concerned about me in the slightest. Quickly, I took inventory. The not-nesser had taken my tool belt and sword as well most of my clothes, leaving me down to the long johns, socks, and long-sleeved shirt I'd been wearing beneath everything else. It even took my fucking hair tie. Good thing I was wearing layers. Piece of shit probably would have left me there nude otherwise. Okay, need to find a crossroads. Just stay calm and think. Was there a road nearby? All I could see were flowers and that damn tree. The two largest hills nearby included the one the tree sat on, and one a bit further away in the opposite direction. Maybe one of them could give a better vantage point. The thought of going near the hanging tree made me even more nervous. So I decided to trust my gut and begin walking towards the hill in the opposite direction. Unlike our world, it was warm. At least I wouldn't have to worry about freezing to death, especially when I had so many other things to be afraid of down there. Things like the Dullahan and other more powerful, ancient things that normally don't bother gracing the surface with their presence. I've technically been below the Mounds before this moment. The church where I'd found the mechanic's name. The cabin Briar had taken me to where Iolo announced he was going to make me a hero. However, it was awesome in the truest sense of that word to be loose in their world. To truly see it. Horizons that I'd thought could only be glimpsed in dreams. While walking, I kept my eyes and ears honed for any sign of movement. For the moment, the wind was the only other thing moving through the field. Meanwhile, in the back of my mind, a multitude of frantic thoughts fought to be the one that frightened me the most. What if I was nowhere near a crossroads? What if Deirdre went ahead and did her escort, not knowing that I wouldn't be meeting her like I was supposed to be? Oh God, what if one of those bastards hurt her while I wasn't around to do anything about it? And holy shit, Iolo is going to kill me when he finds out I lost that sword. Although I have to admit that the idea of a replacement showing up to training instead of me did cheer me up slightly. Not much, but slightly. If my imposter thought that taking over my life was going to be easy in any capacity, it was in for a rude awakening. It had seemed pretty cocky when it found me in the woods. It had fucked around, and sooner rather than later, it was going to find out. However, with how worried I was for Deirdre, I didn't have much time to spare. For her sake as well as mine, I needed to find a way home. I tried not to think about the possibility that I could end up at any crossroads in the world, not just the one in my little Pennsylvanian village. The replacement could have dropped me off at the Isle of Skye for all I knew. Panicking wouldn't do any good, just had to focus on getting to that hill, then go from there. Baby steps. Once I reached the top, I damn near started crying with relief when I saw that there was what appeared to be a dirt road, roughly a quarter of a mile away from my position, a swirling brown ribbon weaving through the flower-covered hills. There was one traveller. Warily I ducked down, hoping it hadn't spotted me. I can't say what it was. I'd never seen anything like it before, and there was nothing about it in our records. 8 hoofed legs, bent like the letter Z against its pale, fleshy trunk. It had no head that I could see. A bony appendage tipped with a scythe-like blade extended from its backside, swaying from side to side as it moved. It was quick, too, leaving only a cloud of dust as it disappeared over the horizon. Shuddering, I determined that it would be best to stay off of the road and to follow it from a distance. Yins have no idea how thankful I was that the mysterious animal hadn't seen me. I know that my description of it reads as somewhat unintelligible. The simple fact is that it didn't resemble anything I'd ever seen before, neighbor or otherwise. It's difficult to compare it to anything purely because of how uniquely incomprehensible it was to behold. There were bound to be more travelers along the way, and I was fairly certain that I didn't want to meet any of them, especially not that one. As I traveled through the Mounds, I was treated to many other otherworldly sights, all of them unforgettable. After experiencing them for myself, I can see why so many people have gone mad after being taken here, though I want it to be known that they weren't all horrific. At one point I heard the thudding of hooves, lots of them. Fearing that it could be that thing I'd attempted to describe earlier, I hid amongst the flowers. However, it wasn't some bizarre tangle of legs and blades. It was a procession. There was a herd of them, all on horseback. The riders were tall, lanky humanoids, all wearing black hoods that concealed their visages. All of the figures, save for the regal-looking neighbor at the front of the group, had their heads down. A few of them wept, reaching up to wipe at their eyes and cover their mouths to stifle sobs. In the back of the procession was a cart pulled by 2 horses. Upon the carriage sat a glass coffin, accented with what looked to be blown glass roses. What appeared to be a beautiful woman lay inside, her arms folded across her chest. White flowers were woven into her hair, making it appear that she'd merely fallen asleep in a meadow. As the procession passed, I was in awe. In their bereavement, they paid me no attention. They were entirely focused on getting the fallen neighbor to her final destination. For the briefest moment, I was distracted from my own distress as I wondered who the lady in the coffin was to have such funerary rites afforded to her. Along with that came the macabre contemplation of how such a neighbor could have perished. The incredible sight was ruined when I heard a crow's call. I was glad that I was already in hiding when I saw a murder of them pass overhead, in their mangled forms that ordinarily can only be seen with a hagstone or a clover. For one moment, I'd completely forgotten that the wild hunt was still a threat down there, possibly even more than they were up above, without Iolo's possessiveness to shield me from their nightmarish impulses. Silently, I hoped that the crows didn't notice me. They didn't linger, so I convinced myself that I was safe for the time being. As I continued onwards, I kept an eye on the skies as well. More time passed. I heard its approach long before I saw it. Screams, a chorus of them, the shrill, guttural cries that make your marrow freeze and muscles tense. Once again, I hid. The ground shook, the tremors intensifying as the source of the shrieks drew nearer. For good measure, I covered my mouth, not wanting to take the chance of whatever was coming to be able to hear me. Whatever it was, it didn't sound friendly. A horned snake the size and length of a cargo train darted along the road in swift, whip-like movements. The screams were deafening, making me shrink down even more as the serpent got closer, trying to become one with the earth. Just as it was about to pass by me, it stopped. It raised its massive head, tasting the dense air with its forked tongue. Blood oozed from its sides each time it moved. Occasionally the scales would shift as the snake glanced around. My heart pounded in my chest as I located the origin of the screams. Tears fell from my eyes as I began to notice what was left of the twisted faces of the souls, trapped within the ridges of its mottled scales. One of them reached out only for their arm to get severed by the scale's sharp edges, falling limply to the road. Was it looking for me? One more soul to add to its collection? It sat there, sniffing around for what felt like millennia. Empires rose and fell in the time it took for the snake to continue on its way. In reality, it probably couldn't have been any longer than a minute or two. Even after it departed, and I couldn't hear the moans of those imprisoned within its flesh anymore, I didn't dare emerge from where I cowered beneath the flower petals, convinced that it was waiting for me just up ahead. How could something like that exist? It's there now, below our feet, looking for more. And worse yet, what if it's not the only one of its kind? How many are out there? After seeing that, it took far longer than I care to admit for me to find the strength to keep going. Between that serpent and the foul air, I remember thinking that it made perfect sense that so many neighbors wanted to leave the Mounds. No wonder they hate us. For what felt like the 1000th time, I prayed that I'd find a crossroads soon. Ending up in the Siberian wilderness, or even in the 6th circle of hell, would have been better than there. It may sound dramatic, but being trapped within a flaming tomb seemed a far less agonizing doom than what I'd just witnessed. I just had to keep going. It could always come back. I couldn't count on the flowers to hide me forever. My distance from the road increased afterwards. From that point on, I was too afraid to look too closely at any more of those traveling along it, only sparing glances to ensure that none of them had noticed me. Eventually, the flower fields began to taper off, giving way to waves of lush, golden grass leading to a ravine of looming cedars. That made me even more uneasy. Yins remember the hunger grass I discussed not too long ago. It could be growing there. I froze, torn between the possibility of encountering a cursed patch of grass and the terrifying prospect of walking on the road. Fuck me. What was I supposed to do? Recalling the snake, I decided that the potential of turning into a starving revenant was the lesser of two evils, and stayed the course, trying to convince myself that the crossroads was just up ahead. While failing to avoid stepping on pine cones and fallen needles, I began to wonder how long it had been since the replacement dumped me down there. According to everything I'd read about the Mounds, time passes differently there. Someone can disappear for what they believe to be a few weeks only to re-emerge and find that years had gone by since they'd left. Everyone that they've ever known is now old and grey while they've barely aged a day. To me, it felt like only a few hours had passed since I reached the forest within the Mounds, but I couldn't trust that. Could a week have passed? Maybe longer. My mum was getting up there in years. What if I never got to say goodbye to her? What if she died, never knowing what happened to me, where I went? Holding back tears, I forced myself to stop thinking like that. Working myself into hysterics was the last thing I needed to do. I was going to get out. I'd find a crossroads if it killed me. That was when I heard a voice on the wind, one that made my heart race for a completely different reason. one I would know anywhere. Deirdre, she was singing, trying to guide me back. Her song was floating along the breeze, drifting south from the direction I'd been walking. At least, I think it was south. It was hard to tell with no sun or moon to orient myself with. The best way I can think of to describe the lighting down there is that it appeared to be frozen in a perpetual twilight, dim, yet not to the point of total darkness. After a few moments of following the Weeper's guidance, a thought made me hesitate. What if it was a trick? Could something out there be imitating her? Reaching within me to use the likeness of someone it knew that I trusted. I've encountered a few neighbors capable of that. The grey men come to mind. I didn't doubt that such things lurked in the hills around me. While I deliberated, the distant cawing of crows made me flinch. I glanced towards where I'd heard them, seeing that their dark wings moved in an ominous cloud along the path I'd been taking before I'd heard Deirdre. A hunter was looking for me. Feeling that I didn't have much of a choice after that, I chased her song, hoping that she'd be the neighbor I'd find at the end of this journey. Slowly, steadily, her words became more clear as I began to get closer to her. Thamisgithis miliemfin, boin narainik, boin narainik. I'd heard her sing it before. We were washing dishes together. She'd started with muttering it under her breath until I encouraged her to speak up. Unsurprisingly, the creep next door pounded on the wall. In response, Deirdre had scowled and proceeded to sing at the top of her lungs just to spite him. Despite my circumstances, I chuckled to myself at the memory. That must have been why she chose to use that one. That way I'd know it was her and not some sort of mimicry. Distantly, I heard music playing while I was hurrying along that did not come from her. Laughter could be heard in the same direction. Despite the uplifting, jolly tune of the instruments, I clapped my hands over my ears as I kept walking. I didn't dare seek it out, keeping my gaze low, relying solely on the wind to guide me until the sounds of merriment were no longer audible. Such parties are not meant for humans. Think of the mechanic, how he can lure you in with just a single note from his banjo, make you forget to be afraid before he uses his music to manipulate your mind and body, how with just a few effortless swipes of his fingers, he can destroy you. Now imagine an entire band made up of musicians just like him. Even as the music faded into the background, I couldn't relax afterwards as I kept following Deirdre's gentle guidance. I didn't think the musicians had noticed me, but even so, I was on edge. Without shoes, my feet were beginning to hurt as I stumbled over stones and tree roots. My jaw was aching from being clenched for so long. I absent-mindedly rubbed at it with one hand, trying to loosen up the sore muscles. Caw! Reflexively, I crouched down into the cover of the lower-hanging branches of a nearby cedar. The crow's call had been close. Far too close for comfort. Stupidly, I found myself wondering if the Mounds had ticks. However, Rocky Mountain fever was the least of my concerns. Hooves, the beating of wings overhead. My trembling hand came up to cover my mouth as I became acutely aware of every gap in the branches surrounding me. Please pass by, please pass by, please pass by. A horrible, gravelly voice called out to me. Either you can come out, or I can come get you. The choice is yours. I closed my eyes, taking a deep breath. The crows chuckled amongst themselves, settled in the canopy above. No use hiding at that point. All it would serve to do is anger my pursuer, and I didn't have to come out to know who would be waiting for me on the other side of the trees. Steeling myself as best as I could, I slunk out of my hiding spot to meet the white sun of mist. While Victor's description of the god of the wild hunt hadn't been inaccurate, mere words can't do him justice. Much like the wilds he commanded, he was sublime, bearing the same terrifying majesty as the path I'd taken to get as far as I did. His head was inclined in the direction of Deirdre's song, as if appraising it, those massive antlers cutting a sharp profile against the glittering imitation of a sky above us. The king of the wild hunt sat astride some sort of beast with ram-like curved horns, standing at the same height as the average draft horse. Its shaggy white fur appeared as if it had just been brushed. The beast watched me with complete disinterest, one of its teardrop-shaped ears twitching judgmentally, as if I was the most unimpressive thing it had ever laid eyes on. Unsure, I gave the white son of mist an awkward bow, not wanting to cause offense, but also uncertain if he expected such gestures from me. Gwyn didn't appear to notice, white eyes following Deirdre's voice as if he could visualize the words she spoke. He remarked mildly, "She's talented, I'll give her that much." The beast shook its head as if it disagreed. The god finally deigned to acknowledge me, looking me from head to toe. Somehow, his gaze bore the same chill that can be felt only during the most piercing winter winds. I had the vulnerable urge to cover my chest with my arms, but I resisted it. Gwyn ap Nudd was the last being to look weak in front of. His smile was sardonic. We didn't get the opportunity to meet on Callan Gaiaf, but I know who you are. Though, truth be told, I'd expected you to be clothed for our first interaction, and armed. I was taken by surprise, I muttered, forcing myself to meet his gaze. Ordinarily, I'd advise against looking a hunter directly in the eye, but according to what Victor had said, it wouldn't make a difference with Gwyn. If he wanted to get into my head, he'd be able to with ease. It was better not to look as timid and squeamish as I felt. Even though I stand taller than most, he gave me the experience of being the same height as a field mouse. Ah, yes, a changeling, the White Son of Mist said, one of the lowest of us. This is a disappointment, Dog of Orion, given who you're working with. I'd expected you to be capable of defending yourself against such a weak opponent, especially after your victory against the Dullahan. A flare of anger rose in me after that, but I held my tongue. Instead, I diverted back to the way I used to address higher officers while in service. Yes, sir, I replied humbly. The god's chuckle made the hair on the back of my neck stand as tall as the trees surrounding us. You were wise not to say what you were thinking, though you'd be even wiser not to harbor such insolence in the first place. I swallowed back panic as I told him, I won't let it happen again, sir. Even now, as I sit in the relative safety of my home once again, I'm afraid to even consider saying something remotely snarky about him. I feel like he'd know. With one hand on the reins, the White Son of Mist guided his steed to turn towards where Deirdre had been leading me. Shall we? The beast side-eyed me as I walked alongside them both. When Gwyn addressed it, I learned its name was Carngrun. I learned afterwards that it means terror of the field. No kidding, I probably spelled that wrong. By the way, if so, I humbly apologize to the Welsh for butchering your language. What's also interesting about this steed is that in the accounts I've found, it's often described as being a white horse. I wonder if that's how it appears outside of the Mounds. Admittedly, I was afraid to speak much during our trek. Hell, I was afraid to think after being admonished earlier. The quiet was tense with only the beast's hooves to fill it. Carngrun snorted at me, though it sounded a bit more like a scoff, a dismissive, rude sound. He thinks you're being too skittish, Gwyn informed me with a wry smile. I'm inclined to agree. Honesty was appreciated when dealing with the mechanic. Maybe his king would have a similar inclination. Truth be told, I'm not quite sure how to behave around you. I have no desire to make this journey in silence, he answered. You can start by remedying that. There is much you're curious about, correct? I took a deep breath, thinking that the skull Victor found was the most pressing matter to address. I tried to be careful about how I phrased it. May I ask what your intentions with my company are? What knowledge do you have of the hunt, Dog of Orion? I rattled off everything I thought I knew about the Wild Hunt's purpose as well as his ongoing war over Creedelad's affection, while trying to address such matters as carefully as possible. Gwyn's expression was stoic as he listened. I'm sure you've noticed a restlessness among my ranks, he eventually replied. An inclination for cruelty brought about by boredom. Do you know why this is? No, sir. We used to greet warriors into our ranks. We attended great battles to offer the honorable a chance to ride amongst those of their equal, to keep order among the vile. Now we are reduced to butchers, here merely to cull the herd of its most wicked souls. The ones we used to seek out are fewer and further between than ever before. You've all done well to prove that such strong spirits haven't vanished from your race completely. I don't intend to let that slip from my grasp. Come Judgment Day, those under the leader of Orion's employ will be called to service. He paused to grant me a derisive look. I can feel you beginning to panic. Rather pointless, considering that your fate has been sealed since the beginning. Contrary to popular belief, I am not ungracious. You and yours will be rewarded justly, treated to an afterlife of luxury before the final days, and rest assured, it will be several human lifetimes before that happens. Naturally, being told not to panic had the opposite effect. How could I not, after risking everything to learn Iolo's name? After resisting the Wild Hunt's assault on Samhain and the dead duo barely hanging on by the skin of their teeth. The despair I felt in that moment was overwhelming. The ground felt like it was miles away below my feet. My head pounded. It all meant nothing. Bizarrely, my mind went blank after that. No thoughts, no emotion, nothing. Like a pin popping a balloon, leaving me with only a stark hyper-awareness of the physical world around me. The White Son of Mist said coolly, "If you are unable to keep your composure, I will do it for you." I do not tolerate such defeatism. Is that understood? All I could do was nod. As quickly as it had happened, the ability to think returned again. My hands shook afterwards. In fact, I think my whole body did, try as I did to control it. Afraid to even consider revisiting that subject, I changed the topic of discussion. The keening woman who sings for me now is an asset as well. We are in agreement, Gwyn replied, then offered me another smile. I suppose you're going to ask me to order my captain to spare her. I'd considered it, but I'd intended to do it with reverence. For starters, I was going to offer you a bottle of vodka. I glanced down at myself in dismay before adding, and I planned on wearing clothes. The white son of mist let out a soft laugh. I do enjoy a stiff drink on a cold night. I might have looked upon you favorably. How do you look upon me now? I asked apprehensively. He considered briefly before telling me, as of now, I regard you as someone with potential that has yet to be met. The same can be said for your employer, though I must admit, I'm more invested in his progress than yours, and I imagine that if the keening woman were to be disposed of, then we could expect more resistance from Orion, and while we could simply force your subservience, it would be preferable to have willful cooperation. Jesus, no, don't think, stay calm. Are we worth all of this trouble? This time, when the white son of mist grinned down at me, there was a trace of humor in it. As I've said, we seek the honorable. While I was expending so much effort trying to keep my mind cleared, it took a moment for me to notice that Deirdre's song had stopped. Sensing my unease, the king chided me. You can't expect the poor girl to sing all day, can you? I guess not, I conceded. A crow settled on the ground by Gwyn, the puppet of the wild hunt, slumping under the weight of the patchy wings that had been forced onto it. I didn't want to look at it, but I felt Gwyn's presence as strongly as a bad memory and knew he'd disapprove. They had forced the sharp beak into the former human's skull haphazardly, making it so that when its jaws parted, they didn't quite meet up correctly. The skin drooped around its empty eye sockets, wrinkling like the flesh of a rotting apple. It spoke to the king, but I couldn't understand a word of it. I am needed elsewhere, Gwyn informed me after the crow said its piece. Another has opted to escort you the rest of the way. I'm sure you can guess who was gracious enough to volunteer. Don't think. I bowed, just as awkwardly as before, as I said, I appreciate that you took the time to take me this far, and for answering my questions. Gwyn snorted again, shaking his head as if to say, yeah, you better be grateful. The white son of mist merely gave me a nod before they departed. Still trying to keep my mind in check, not sure of the limits of the god's reach, I kept walking in the same direction we'd been heading. I was dreading meeting up with Iolo, but at least around him, I didn't have to worry about thinking the wrong way. Sure enough, after some time had passed, I heard that damned banjo's notes floating through the trees in front of me. Begrudgingly, I followed it, ready to literally and figuratively face the music. However, when I finally came across Iolo, I was surprised to discover that he wasn't alone. He perched on a fallen tree's trunk, claws strumming the strings of his instrument delicately. Deirdre sat across from him, staring forlornly at the ground until she heard my approach. Her face lit up with relief as she jumped from her seat, hurrying over to throw her arms around my shoulders. When that imposter came home instead of you, she whispered into my hair, I feared the worst. I trapped it the moment it walked through the door. But then it took us days to... My eyes widened as I gasped. Days? Iolo's cool confirmation made me stiffen. Yup, days. 3 of them, if you were curious. Caused quite a ruckus. It had only been a few hours for me. So, about your sword, Iolo started. Despite his cheery tone, I could tell by the subtle bite of his words that he was livid. He stopped playing to reach beside him, producing Ratcatcher. My jaw dropped when I saw that the blade was bent. It more closely resembled a fishhook than a sword. We used to do this in the old days, he explained darkly, his earlier false friendliness long gone. You kill a man, you bend their sword to shame 'em. Shit! I ran a hand through my hair, unable to look away from the blade. It took me by surprise. It released some mushroom stuff that made me pass out. Well, that's something we're going to have to work on, he snapped with an aggrieved sigh, also rising to loom over me. And I'm going to have to fix this shit now. Without thinking, I retorted, allow me to extend my condolences for how difficult my abduction was for you. Deirdre squeezed my shoulder gently. Not the time. We should leave. Meanwhile, Iolo snickered. Didn't enjoy your time down here, Fiona? Deirdre sounded like an underpaid babysitter as she urged us, please, can you two bicker along the way? It isn't safe here. Nah, I said what I needed to, Cunard, Iolo replied. Lest Fiona has some more annoying shit to say, I got it all out of my system. I just shook my head as I marched onward, not taking the bait. Thankfully, there was no more excitement as the pair led me back to our world. The world that is so blissfully boring without giant snakes and massive things with far too many legs. Our world is quite underrated, to be honest. I love it here, and I take back everything I said about Pennsylvania. Somehow, the banjo bastard and I managed not to argue. We made the trip in terse silence, the three of us speaking only when necessary. Afterwards, Deirdre filled me in on what happened to the replacement. Once she'd had it trapped, she didn't waste any time in getting a hold of Victor. The boss had interrogated it about my whereabouts while Rayner and Deirdre aided Wes as he worked to track my scent, but to no avail. Then Iolo showed up. The replacement apparently became much more forthcoming after that. When it comes to what I learned to be the destiny of Orion, I'm still terrified to question it. Victor was solemn when I broke the news, but he didn't seem surprised. When it comes to Rayner, it gets a little curious, considering that she is fairly religious due to her practices. Will the White Son of Mist have to duke it out with Jesus? Is it sacrilegious to bring such an idea up? Meanwhile, shockingly enough, Wes didn't seem delighted about the prospect of someday being forced to serve the same party that had hunted him for sport. I just simply won't die, he said with a shrug. Or I'll sell my soul to someone else. Let them sort that out. There's an idea, any kind. Gentle neighbors out there want some pest control specialist souls. They qualify for the Cyber Monday sale that's going all the way until the second week of December. Get 'em now while supplies last, excludes members of the Wild Hunt. So that brings us to Deirdre's last keening session. I am pleased to say that it was relatively uneventful, pleasant even. It was an older man who'd been ready. He hadn't fussed or argued, just followed. Lathanan grasnis aya tigin dwindluth a shlanager bon tainig thunuas, a shlanager bon tainig thunuas. Once her song was complete, I stared at her in anticipation, but honestly, I don't know what I expected to happen. For her to be cocooned in sparkles and light like a butterfly. Is that it? I asked intelligently. She frowned back at me, brows creased. I believe so. Experimentally, she removed the canteen from her shoulder. After taking a few moments to prepare herself, she twisted off the cap and inverted the flask. Together we watched the dirt drink it up. Deirdre paused when it got down to the last drops, flinching and squeezing her eyes shut as she quickly shook them out. Once again I waited for some dramatic fanfare, or for one of the hunters to find some loophole around what Gwyn had said to snatch her away. But once again, there was nothing. Blissful, wonderful, boring nothing. She slowly raised her hand to my cheek, her frown deepening as she cupped it affectionately. I asked her if she could feel anything. Sadly, she shook her head. Maybe it'll take some time, I tried to reassure her. It could be a slow transition back to human, you know. You've been a weeper for decades. She sounded distant as she said, maybe.